So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this very interesting debate. And we agreed with Manuela Ripa, who was going to make the concluding remarks, and she can't unfortunately do that because of the other engagements that she would start. And she's one of the new, very prominent colleagues and in depth in the subjects to join us in Globe. So very happy to have her here, and please do have your say for us.
Yes, thank you so much, Sirpia, for your kind words, and a warm welcome from my side to everybody here in the room, but also online. Let us not forget that this is a streamed event, and it's good so, because I don't know if you know, or you maybe have realized, we have at the moment some traffic issues in Brussels. The trains are not going. That's why it's so important that we have this event also online, and it is also recorded. So people who are not able to join us today can also see the event later. So a warm welcome again from my side to today's conference, Charting the Path to Sustainable Economic Development. And Sirpa already mentioned I was foreseen for the closing remarks, but as I have to open an exhibition at 1 o'clock together with colleagues on the harsh reality of industrial animal farming, I'm happy to have the opportunity to address you with some words here. I'm thankful for Sirpa, and I'm also thankful to Anders Wiegmann that he will do the closing remarks. Thank you very much, Anders, for that. And I'm really happy that in the light of the Beyond Growth conference, maybe you have to mute yourself who are online. Thank you very much. Verena Weil is here. Maybe you can mute yourself. So I'm happy that in the light of the Beyond Growth conference we had in the Parliament in 2023, with this conference we engage in further discussions to challenge conventional policymaking in the EU in order to redefine societal goals across the board, moving away from harmful focus on economic growth as the sole basis of our development model. First of all, let me thank Globe EU, and here especially Roland-Jan, who co-organized this event together with us, Sirpa and me, and of course my office and Sirpa's office for helping organizing this event. Some thoughts about today's topic. The Greek philosopher Heraclius once said, "Panta rei," everything flows. This things change. It's probably one of the few constants of our being that things always adapt to new situations. The history of our universe, our planet, our nature, and our evolution bears witness to this. We are already experiencing it again, as from the 20s of this millennium. Fundamental principles that we have firmly believed in are collapsing and must be completely reconsidered. It is not only the war in the Ukraine, the US after the second election of Donald Trump as president, this is such a deep disruption. Already the pandemic has caused us to doubt previously supposedly fixed natural precepts. As we face unprecedented ecological challenges and shifting societal expectations, we are called to rethink and reshape our economic paradigms. We must move beyond mere quantitative growth and embrace a model that harmonizes our economic ambitions with the ecological limits of our planet. I represent the Ecologic Democratic Party, ÖDP. One of our founding principles was the fight against profit, and my party was founded 43 years ago. Mensch vor Profit, human before profit, is one of the persistent slogans of our political movement. My party organized already several discussions and 2 symposia about the limits of growth over the years, and also published books about it. To be honest, some 50 years ago, when my party was founded, the alternatives to growth were looked upon as naive. It is therefore with great pleasure to see such a huge interest in this conference today, giving us hope that the vision of my party to have an economic system that prioritizes human well-being and ecological sustainability over GDP growth may become reality one day. We will discuss a lot of aspects today, and we have invited renowned experts to provide us with answers as to whether we can shape an economy that aims at the well-being of all and preserves the ecological basis of life. Dear all, here present and online, together we have the opportunity to forge a path that not only meets the needs of today, but also safeguards the future for generations to come. So thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to a vibrant and inspiring exchange of ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuela. And on my behalf, once again, welcome to all of you, the late incomers that were stuck in the traffic so far. And I'm not going to use much of your time because we have a Jim Jackson. I'm very eagerly waiting for your presentation, plus very distinguished panels. But a couple of points. Okay, we do have the Green Deal and Industrial Plan, and their objectives to accelerate circular economy, the energy transition, and the clean energy, plus then to gear our budgets more on the right direction, for example, laxing the state aid rules and issues like this. Okay, a lot of good deeds, but very small steps. And at the same time, as you might have noticed, there's a lot of activities in the Commission and in the Parliament going exactly on the opposite direction. The omnibus, throwing the baby and leaving the water, not simplifying the reporting scheme to single access point reporting, but raising the levels and weakening the reporting scheme altogether. How does this help? Then we have probably on the pipeline debate about the emission limits on cars. We have rumors that there are willingness to reopen the forest degradation and all the forest regulation package. There's a huge resistance to even have existing environmental rules in our common agricultural policy. So it is a bit of alarming news. And beside that, and this is my, I guess, biggest worry is that we have a tendency to side tracks and sunk investments. Think of CSS, carbon capture and usage makes sense in certain circles to make the CO2, the carbon, to recycle because it's used anyway. But to have storage, I'm not quite sure how this energy and CO2 balance goes all together and what is the certain. Bioeconomy, meaning burning the forests, another example. And I could go, unfortunately, pretty long. So how do we avoid putting our money on the wrong place and actually stalemating ourselves on the wrong track? Because as you know, this is a question of transforming our economy. It's a transition. I'm sure that the team is going to talk about. And if we do reflected our measuring systems like beyond the GDP initiative in our budgets, in our semesters, we are not going to get on the right track. We are just doing the same thing as before, but not adequately, because diesel has its limits, as we know. And then it is the whole lifestyle issues Manuela was talking about, how you create welfare. The economy, after all, was made for the people and not people for the economy. And last but not least, I hope I don't depress you too much, it is the war on Ukraine that sort of overruns everything, even clear thinking. And the reaction to everything is, no, you can't do this because we have to fight the war first. we have to secure our defense and security. Well, guess how long that is going to take? And if we are going to wait with the climate, I'm not going to go to this archive of warnings what we get from the IMF, from ECB, from universities, that the climate change is going to cost a hell lot of more than it is required now today. Not only after 100 years, but within 10 years. So if we do not change our economy, we have no chance of solving the issue. And if we do not solve this, actually, sorry my language, this war of the Ukraine might look like children's party compared to what is going to face us. So we are talking very serious issues. We would need to get a better understanding together, better strategy how to communicate it, and try to find a way to impact the Commission, the European Parliament, and to activate businesses to do the same, because it really needs a lot of force. But that's from my side, and now we'll turn to keynote address. Jim Jackson from Surrey University. Could you please show your book that I fully recommend you all would read? No, I do not get the percentage out of the sale of it, and I guess you don't either. With the prices what they are, is going to present us with the topic sustainable prosperity within planetary boundaries, a new vision for Europe's economy. And the first panel then is defining the sustainable prosperity. The second, how we should change and what we should do in our finance system. And then the last but not least about the new economic models. So, Tim, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sirpa. And thank you for doing my work for me. That's brilliant. I will talk a little bit about the book, or I might mention it, but I actually want to start where Manuela started, and I want to get to where Sirpa was going. So thank you for those kind introductions. I was thinking about what should I give you, having made your way through train strikes and European Parliament security, and wondered if you would like a little stock flow consistent ecological macroeconomics to begin your morning with. But then I decided it's not even 10 o'clock yet, that can wait till a little bit later. It is an important topic when it comes to thinking about beyond growth, because somehow we have to make the economy work, and so it does involve us. As Dirk was reminding me actually just before we started, not only in profit and loss for individual companies, but also the public debt and fiscal sustainability for countries as a whole. So we do have to kind of get to that point. But let's start instead with philosophy, Greek philosophy in particular. And Manuela mentioned Heraclitus and the idea that everything is change, which of course it is. I want to nuance that idea a little bit when we get a little bit further into the talk. But I also want to start with Aristotle, because basically the idea of this session, the question, what is prosperity, sustainable prosperity within planetary limits? What can prosperity possibly mean? What can it look like on a finite planet? That's been a kind of research question for my research centres and groups, in an academic context, admittedly, but also bringing that into policy fora, into industry, into NGO forums as well. What can prosperity look like is an old question, and it does, go back to the Greek philosophers, to Aristotle, for example. For Aristotle, and this is a point I want to come back to, the good life is something to do with virtue, but virtue, in an Aristotelian sense, is not a kind of unassailable moral good, as we might think about it today. It's a little bit more like virtuosity, being able to do something really, really well, being in balance, being in tune with your task, being in flow with your task, even as Heraclitus might have recognized. And in any case, not being out of balance so long, even as things are changing, that you can't identify that point where the good life lives. But I want you to just hold that idea in your minds as we go through the talk, because it's a really, really important one, and it's underlined by some of the other stuff that I want to look at. When we were asking this question, what can prosperity possibly mean on a finite planet? When I was originally in the Sustainable Development Commission, the UK Sustainable Development Commission, one of the things that came up over and over again, essentially, was the idea that prosperity, first and foremost, is more about health than it is about wealth. And that's a critical starting point for thinking beyond growth. It's a critical starting point for thinking about what prosperity can possibly mean. It's a critical starting point for thinking about limits and the impact of limits on health and on the economy. And I want to go to the WHO back in 1948 in thinking about what health is. And it's not, as the WHO says, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So it's a very well-rounded concept. It includes our psychological well-being. It has a lot in common, of course, with the dialogue nowadays around the well-being economy. And it brings in many of the dimensions that we want to think about when we think beyond growth. It's also worth saying that this relationship between health and our more conventional way of thinking about prosperity matters. So there is a relationship to some extent between health and income, and it becomes particularly obvious when you have very low incomes. So here is a data that I put together way back in the day. It's very well used nowadays. It's the relationship between life expectancy, a pretty powerful indicator of health, and income over time. And I'm sorry at the back, you can't really see it, but basically what it's telling you is that life expectancy pretty much doubles when you go from having nothing to going to around about $10,000 per capita. So life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa in some countries is around about 40, and it gets to about 80 by the time you're in Latin America, which is a pretty substantial improvement in health. And it leads you to suppose that maybe actually growth is a really important thing, and particularly for the poorest countries, I think that evidence can be sometimes supported. But then after that point, something really strange happens, which is that the curve tails off. You get what economists like to call diminishing marginal returns to extra income. And in fact, if you look carefully at the line along the top there, you'll find that it's not, as my trend line generously suggests, still going up, but actually coming down, that life expectancy is coming down. And that's now subsequently been acknowledged in certain Western countries, in the US in particular. It's stagnating in many other countries. So that for all our extra income, we're not delivering on fundamental aspects of prosperity like health. Now, what does that tell us about our economy? I want to focus, and I'm getting a little bit into ecological macroeconomics, if you like, but I want to do it in a very simple way. I want to focus on thinking about the kinds of activities that we want in our economy. What is an economy that delivers us prosperity as health? And of course, fundamentally, health and social care activities are a fundamental part of that. They deliver to us our health, they maintain our health. But there's a number of other activities. We can't do without food, for example, that's absolutely clear. We can't do without decent housing. We can't do without sanitation. All of these things enter into the equation of what the economy is trying to do. Let's suspend the question of growth for the moment and suppose that we're just in search of the good life, in search of well-being, and we're trying to deliver this well-being economy. All of these things will have some material impact, and all of them, interestingly, will provide jobs for people. Both of those things matter, but in very different ways. The bigger the material impact, the worse those activities are for the planet. The more jobs they provide, the better that is potentially for society. So I want to just look at the composition of our economies in terms of a mix, if you like, of jobs on the one side and greenhouse gases on the other. So this graph kind of shows a picture of jobs versus carbon, if you like, and this is the EU 27. And again, it's a little bit on the small side for those of you at the back, but the vertical scale tells you how much CO2, carbon equivalent, actually, its greenhouse gases are involved. So the higher it is, the more intense the impact. And the horizontal scale, the one along the bottom, tells you the employment intensity, the number of jobs per $1 million of economic final demand, as it's called. What's our economy calling for in terms of products? So the yellow dot, for those of you who can see it on the left-hand side at the bottom, that is the finance and tech industry. Now, because I've put finance and tech together, I'm missing some of the large energy demands of the tech industry, and it's being smoothed out by the rather small demands of the finance industry. And you'll see actually that it's actually very, very poor in terms of providing jobs. It's relatively good at keeping down carbon, but it's very poor at providing jobs. And then the big red dot somewhere in the middle of the graph, that's manufacturing. Manufacturing is middling range at providing jobs. It's relatively high in terms of the embedded carbon in those activities. So the more stuff we make, the bigger our impacts on the planet. It does employ some people, although fewer and fewer, the more it becomes machined and produced by artificial intelligence and robots, but nonetheless still, in some sense, across Europe as a whole, providing some employment. And then I want to move your attention down to the lower right-hand corner. Now, the lower right-hand corner, to some extent, is the place I've indicated maybe we want to be. It's the place where the carbon impact is low and the employment intensity is high. Lots of jobs, not too much carbon. What are those activities? They are essentially, well, healthcare and service and social care is down there. Arts and creativity is down there. Hospitality is down there somewhere. A number of other services that contribute to human well-being, the sorts of things that contribute to our quality of life, employ lots of people and are relatively low in carbon. Does this differ country by country? Well, it differs a little bit. Just for comparison, here's the UK version of the same thing. You'll see we've put a little bit more effort into finance. Surprise, surprise, a little bit less effort into manufacturing, which has exposed us to various fragilities in world markets, particularly over the last, what is it now, unbelievably 8 years. And nonetheless, we have the same structure of a sector of the economy, which is around a set of activities which contribute to quality of life and are relatively low in terms of carbon. Where am I going with this? I want to suggest that when we think about dealing with climate change, we think mainly about technology and about technological substitution. We think mainly about renewable energy, let's say. And that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. We have to bring down the carbon intensity of all of these economic activities, and energy is the basis for that. So we do need that investment. But I'm suggesting in a way that there's another kind of a strategy, a really important strategy, which is to focus on those sectors of the economy which contribute to well-being, which improve our health, which deliver prosperity as health, which are low in carbon, and which provide employment in the economy. And that's the economy that I talk about when I talk about the care economy. And it's a place that I think offers a kind of vision beyond growth, in principle, in which we can not only do Greek philosophy, but we can also do ecological macroeconomics. We can ask the questions of how this economy works, why it doesn't work, where it doesn't work, how we could make it work, what the policies are that would support this economy. And in the remaining time, I just want to talk a little bit more about that. Let me just define care a little bit, because care is a difficult and potentially a dangerous word. And so I want to just be a little bit careful with it. Let's start with a definition from Joan Tronto and Berenice Fisher. And they define care as an activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. So almost immediately, actually, I've become almost tautological. I'm defining the care economy around doing the things which make our world as the best possible world that we can live in, that we can live in it as well as possible. And on the right there's a whole bunch of things that we could do to achieve that around lifestyles, around livelihoods, around livability in our communities, around liquidity in our financial markets, and indeed around the legitimacy of our political environment. And those are all things that we can practically do. But I want to just add a kind of word of warning in relation to the word care, because we can think of it either as the special pleading of a subsector of our economy, which is clearly not what I was pointing to when I pointed to that big diagram, that idea of the care economy as an organizational principle for our economic activities. Or we can also think of it as a kind of unassailable moral good, something that is by definition the right thing to do and the right thing to be, and goes along with all those words like good and friendship and courage, the things that we can't dare actually to deny or to question as unassailable moral goods. Care is obviously good. Why would you say that? If you think that it might not be, then how could you possibly be a decent human being? Now, it is, of course, it does have some moral force, but the point that I want to make, and it's quite an important point, is this, that care, if it's thought of as an unassailable moral good, becomes virtually useless as an analytical tool. And so I want to think a little bit more about what care means in the context of the idea of prosperity as balance. And to go back to that, I really have to look at what the idea of health means. And the characteristics of health, and in particular, the characteristic of health, despite Heraclitus, that everything flows all the time, is actually around balance. It's around keeping things in balance. It's around keeping the body in balance. The body has its own innate, inbuilt carer that cares the entire time for any number of balances in our body. Our heart rate, our breathing rate, our blood sugar, blood glucose, our acidity in the blood, and indeed our dopamine in the brain. And it attempts to keep all of these things in balance all the time. Now, one of the things that emerged out of the early days of physiology, actually, was the understanding that this wisdom of the body, this internal balancing mechanism, is trying to achieve this balance in the face of constantly changing external conditions. So those external conditions matter. It matters what kind of world we're trying to live in. We cannot rely on this innate caring process within our body, this attempt to restore us into balance, which is how I like to think about care, in the context of things that change massively around us, and in particular, in things which systematically attempt to keep us away from that balance. And that becomes particularly dangerous when it comes to things that keep us systematically away from that balance, that are profit-making enterprises for a set of people who can become very rich from them. And I just want to give you an example of that. The most obvious example is the relationship between food and health, and blood glucose in particular and health. Now, we live in a dietary environment which, as some people have noted, is obesogenic. We live in an environment which is invaded by high-density foods to which the body is very ill adapted. It's very ill adapted to the quantity of those foods, but it is highly addicted to those foods themselves. Now, that happened in the evolutionary environment. It happened for a reason. We became programmed to search after energy-rich foods because the environment was energy poor. The food environment was energy scarce. And so we had within our brain a reward circuit that drew us continually to search for those sources of high energy, high sugar rich foods. And salt and saturated fat go into that category as well. A whole bunch of foods. You want me to wind up?
No.
No. You want me to go on? I know it's just getting to the interesting bit, because we all eat, and we all, to some extent, are subject to the forces of this obesogenic environment. None so, as I discovered myself during the writing of the book, than me personally, but that's a separate story. The point is that this wisdom of the body is easily derailed in an environment to which we were not adapted, and not least, of course, in relation to our reward circuits and the dopamine hits that we are constantly encouraged, not just through food, but through social media, through media online, through the constant availability of all kinds of things that trigger our reward circuits to go on looking for more, so that we are, if not actual addicts in this society, close to the point of becoming addicts in some respect, whether that's sugar, whether that's online pornography, whether that's hits and likes on social media, whether it is alcohol, whether it's drugs, whether it's prescription drugs or black market drugs, we are all close to becoming addicts, partly through our evolutionary design, but also because we live in an environment which constantly monetizes that dopamine reward circuit and hijacks our own neuropsychology. Now, which of those things can we change? I'm asking it obviously as a rhetorical question. We can't do anything about who we evolved as. We're not going to do anything about the fact that we are, in my case, sugar addicts. And so the only thing we can do is actually to find some ways of avoiding that environment or going around that environment or working against that environment. At the individual level, that's always possible. You have to work, trust me, incredibly hard to do it. But it is to some extent possible to do that. Can we expect, in terms of public health, for example, can we expect that to happen across a huge swathe of the population, the entire population exposed to addictive substances, pulling us out of balance, contributing massively to climate change and to the environmental degradation, undermining our own health through the most basic function of all? And I want to give you an economic example of the implications of that. This is from the UK, a study I did for the Food, Farming, Countryside Commission. Nobody here is going to be surprised about the health costs of the British diet. And you might think, of course, that you do slightly better in some European countries. That's undoubtedly true. It's a lot worse in the US, let me tell you. I, on the back of writing the book, did a report for the Food, Farming, Countryside Commission to try and figure out exactly what that cost was. And it turned out to be massive, £268 billion, which is more than all health spending in the UK, are the health-related costs of the chronic disease incurred by people having poor diets across the board. And by contrast, actually, if you asked what would it cost for the government, say, anybody, to pay for everybody to eat healthily, the costs are much smaller. So the left-hand cost is the existing cost of food plus the health costs. The right-hand column is an additional green amount that you'd have to contribute to allow everybody, even the poorest households in the country, to afford healthy food. And it's a fraction of those overall costs. In other words, what we call the economy is a false economy. What we call economic growth actually quite often is what Herman Daly once termed uneconomic growth. And that's a place from which we can start, because potentially it's a place that both Treasury and the Department of Health and the department that governs food in whichever country you're in can have some handle on, legitimately have some handle on. You can work at this. It becomes a process that you can delve into, that you can understand the dynamics of, that you can invite into the room those who are responsible for it. You can make the case that actually the public good is being undermined by private interest, and you can show it in medical terms across the population. This is a place for transformation. It's a direction to go. I will finish, Manuela. I just want to touch on a couple of really important issues. They're issues that I stumbled on in this book, in the writing of the book, in a couple of ways. The first, of course, is to note that actually, when you talk about care, and when you talk about it in terms of its sexual definition, it cannot be left unsaid that 75%, 3/4 of all care work, paid and unpaid, is carried out by women. This is a highly gendered debate. And yes, I am aware that I'm sitting here as a man saying that, and it really did trip me up, almost literally, when I was writing the book. But actually, that question of how gender fits into this really does matter. And that gender division of labour is going on. There's a wonderful report last year, I don't know if you saw the Global Gender Gap report from the World Economic Forum. It estimated that the global gender gap would close in approximately 134 years' time at current rates of progress, which, interestingly, and I looked at the data the year before, it was 133 years the year before, and a year later it became 134 years, which does, if my maths is correct, suggest that actually we've been slowing down over that year that I didn't look at the report. There's another aspect of the gender division of labour that is really, really important, and it was the second thing that kind of tripped me up when I was writing the book. I started writing the book back in 2021 after the pandemic, when all the messages seemed very obvious. And then in the spring, February of 2022, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the world became a very, very different place. And so I was drawn inextricably from the beginning to the idea that actually we live in a world in which violence matters, in which we have to take seriously violence. And I was saved, in a sense, from my own despair about this by a book called Care and Capitalism by Kathleen Lynch, where she says you can't hope to understand care unless you look and understand at the concept of violence. And I began to see those two things, actually, as a part of this puzzle that had to be looked at when we take seriously the idea of the care economy. It's all very well to turn up at meetings like these and have a rose-tinted vision of a beautiful world in which everybody cares for each other. That cannot be the task. It has to be both pragmatic in economic terms. It also has to be honest in philosophical terms. It has to address the question of violence. And actually, there's another gender division in violence. Most violence is enacted by men. Most violence enacted by men is enacted on women. Those are facts. And some of that is state-sanctioned. We're living in a world in which that call to violence is becoming a louder and louder call away from care, quite literally, drawing budgets out of care to put them into armament. And rearmament, violence as care's nemesis, actually is one of the ways of thinking about this. Another way, more hopeful ways to think of care as violence's antidote. But I just want to talk about these figures. Rearming the EU, you will have heard the 800 billion euros that are being allocated to rearmament over the next 5 years. There was an attempt after the pandemic to do something different. The Resilience and Recovery Facility allowed nation states to invest in health infrastructure as part of their contribution to recovery. So to date, 53 billion euros have been allocated to health, as opposed to the 800 that we're going to find for rearmament. But the dedicated EU for Health investment project only allocated 5.3 billion between 2021, when it was set up, and 2027 in a couple of years' time. A fraction of what we are now prepared to dedicate towards rearmament. My point here, and it was a point that was made very, very well by Jeffrey Sachs when he spoke in the European Parliament a couple of years ago, and I do really recommend listening to Jeffrey Sachs and everything he's saying about the rush towards rearmament, towards violence, away from diplomacy. My point is, if you look at international conflict through the lens of care, where does care sit? Does it sit in rearmament? Does it sit in sending profits to arms manufacturers that will destabilize our world, to create products which are literally designed to destroy people and destroy buildings? Or does it perhaps sit in diplomacy? Diplomacy is a restorative act. It is, by the definition that I'm using for the word care, a part of what care means. It restores us to health, to balance. It guides us away from instability. It's a foundation for a conversation which, in thinking beyond growth, in thinking beyond the dynamics of growth, in thinking about the dynamics of health, in thinking about prosperity as health, we have come ever closer to in the last few years. And that, to me, makes this conversation here today one of the most important things that's happening in the Parliament. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for your very insightful intervention. And now I'll turn to Manuela to continue.
Yes, thank you so much. So we will ask the speakers of the next panel to join us here on at this table. And there are also a few free seats here. If somebody wants to sit here, is it right? Is that free? No, not the one in front, the one behind. There are also behind some free seats. So, dear Tim, consumer protection and healthy nutrition is one of my main topics in the European Parliament. I'm fighting already for 5 years. So I was absolutely fascinated listening to you, and I would have not dared to interrupt you. So it was not a bad look at you, but I was very admiring, and I thank you very much for your impressive keynote speech that gave us a lot of thoughts. So our next panel, we will have Xiao Ting online. We have Victor Canille here in the room. If you would like to join us, thank you very much, Victor. Then we have Rutger Höckstra, who's also online, but Dirk is also here, so please, Dirk, join us at this panel. We are running late, so this is why I will immediately start. And I'm very pleased to have this panel discussion where we are talking about defining sustainable prosperity and planetary boundaries. And we will hear some key concepts. And I will ask the panelists really to stick to 5 minutes. I have the watch here, so I will interrupt you. And I will... afterwards, they have some time to reflect about what the other speakers said. And then, of course, I will ask the audience to come up with questions to the panelists. Can also the people online ask questions? Or? Okay, perfect. So also online question we will take up. So now I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Yao-Ting Wu-Jones, who will join our panel online. She is the Government and Policy Lead at the Donut Economics Action Lab, in short, DEAL. DEAL is dedicated to applying the so-called donut economics principles to policymaking with the goal to enable a just and sustainable transition for cities, businesses and governments to a new form of economies. One which focus on regeneration and distribution. With a background in environmental management, ecosystem services and climate policy, Xiaoting has worked across 58 countries and gained valuable insights how reshaping policy and governance for state sustainability can take place. So I'm very curious now and delighted to hear her thoughts, how our societies can move beyond GDP and grow in order to build a more sustainable, equitable future. Xiaoting, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Emmanuel. It's a tall order. Sorry I can't be there with you today, mainly because of my carrying responsibility at home. As Emmanuel already mentioned, the donut economics, as you can see on the screen, propose some fundamental economic mindset shifts required to help humanity thrive in the 21st century, a caring economy. Its essence is captured in a book published by my colleague Kate Raworth in 2017, titled Donut Economics: 7 Ways to Think Like 21st Century Economists. It draws on diverse economic perspectives and aims to make economics accessible for everyone. So we can indeed have an economic discussion. At 9 o'clock in the morning, we can talk with our children and our relatives and friends about economics, because we fundamentally believe that a lot of the economic assumptions embedded in our society today shape a lot of the power dynamics, the national and international policies. So we must all become economists to be more fluent in the language and knowing what are some of the assumptions and how we can practically change it and transform our society for better. So it starts, donut economics, called donut economics because we want to make it fun and accessible. It starts with a donut, one of the possible new comforts for societal progress in the 21st century, to replace the endless obsession with GDP growth. The aim is meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So it consists of these 2 concentric rings, which help us thrive in balance, as Tim mentioned. Inside is a social foundation to ensure that no one is left falling short of life's essentials. And this outside the ecological ceiling to ensure that humanity does not collectively overshoot the planetary boundaries that protect Earth's life-supporting system. Between the 2 sets of boundary lies a donut-shaped space that's both ecologically safe and socially just, space in which humanity can thrive in balance. And if we look at the inside social foundation, politically, we can draw on sustainable development goals that's agreed by many countries around the world. And then outside, we have the Earth systems scientists already telling us the 9 planetary boundaries and those delicately balanced systems that support life on Earth. But if we look at the local scales, we can actually be playful and adapt this into local context, local social and economic culture context. And some of the cities and the regions in the world already started to do so. And I wouldn't be able to go through all the 7 ways of thinking in 5 minutes, but I just, listening to Tim, I thought it's really important probably to look at the second ways of thinking about our economy. What is our economy? It's actually embedded in our society, influenced by political, social, cultural, legal concepts. And our human society is then embedded and supported by our Earth system that's delicately balanced within those planetary boundaries. So our economy is really a subset of the wider society. That's a subset of the wider living world, which is based in solar energy. It draws energy and the living material from the living world and put the waste matter back into the biosphere. So the fundamental economic question we always to ask is not how big we can grow the economy, but actually how can we ensure that the economy throughput is actually in balance, so it does not disrupt the cycle and the stability of our system. And within our economy, we need to recognize there's not just the market and the state, which usually is the debate in economics and policy today, but actually there's 4 essential economic roles that we all have and do play. And there's a household where we care for our elders, our children, we cook our food, and all without those caring services, as Tim mentioned, majority of the caring services carried out by women, the economy simply wouldn't function. And then we also have the commons, which is creative, and we come together not through market or state, but the common values and the purpose, the community gardens, the communal food banks that I have in my community here in Hampshire in UK, which is really important actually for my daily life and my well-being and my health. And how can we actually have an economy that doesn't ask only the question how free to make the market, but how we can value all those complementary and important economic roles. Then we actually embed care in our understanding of our economy and ensure that we actually really for the finance flows to some of the important economic actors that often ignored currently in our economic design, like the household, like the commons, where a lot of the caring activity actually happens. So with that, I think my time probably is up. Just to say that this is not just theoretical. There's different ways of thinking have been applied in cities, regions, communities, businesses, schools, research, academia, and then national and international governments. So in the cities, we actually have more than 50 plus cities, municipality government officially using those ways of thinking to reinvent how they imagine their local economy. And then more than half of that, 31 cities actually in Europe. So that's very encouraging. And also I encourage you to also explore some of the national examples. We have worked with Well-being Economy Alliance looking at different countries and interesting examples of how they're reinventing the economy to be more caring, really looking at how we can reinvent the economic system so it's better for our well-being. And I encourage you also to explore our website to look at how some of the communities and the business are putting this into practice. And with that, that's me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Zhao Ting. Thank you also for staying almost within 5 minutes, but you're very good on time. Thank you so much. And here we again heard the word balance. I think this is one important word that we have to keep in mind for the whole discussion today. Now I'm delighted to introduce Victor Canilla, a doctoral researcher at the University of Lausanne and part of the REAL project. So we just heard the DEAL project. Now we're going to talk about the REAL project. REAL is a European Research Council synergy initiative and focuses on policies and systems which are necessary for a just post-growth transition within planetary boundaries. The project aims to propose fair pathways for reducing material and energy use, maintaining well-being in a post-growth concept, and exploring political models for systemic change. Victor's research within REAL examines the intersections of degrowth, international relations, and the geopolitics of degrowth. I'm very delighted now to hear your thoughts on what sustainable prosperity is and what as a key concept is needed. Victor, the floor is yours.
With pleasure. Thanks a lot, Manuela, and thanks everyone for being here. I'll rush a bit because it's only 5 minutes. So basically, indeed, I'm based in the University of Lausanne. The REAL project is structured with 3 leads, Julia Steinberger in Lausanne and Jason Hickel and Yorgos Kallis in Barcelona. And we've divided in 5 teams where we look at all those dimensions that Manuela just described. And we basically try to get a group picture of all of that through academic discussions. What I will try to do today, however, is not to bore you with our academic papers and nitty-gritty details of how we envision political transformation or the policy landscape, or the post-growth versus degrowth versus eco-socialism versus donut economics type of debates, but more try to bring you 3 thoughts on, let's say, blockers that we face today in implementation of what we would like to promote. So this is partially bad news, but I think we're also here to discuss what's missing in the implementation and why we can keep having those conversations years after years, but if we don't address those blockers at some point, it might feel a bit too repetitive and useless. So we need to also bring these thoughts into the conversation. So the first type of obstacle that I would like to point out, and by the way, I don't want to also be the academic that only critiques stuff. I will also try to point out the solutions this can lead to. So the first one is basically, as has already been mentioned, the budgetary issues. So we know academics that have spent parts of their careers trying to argue that there is money for the ecological transition, that we can invest in renewables, that we can green the infrastructure, and that the austerity type of narratives and we don't have money type of budgetary debates are based on false premises. Now, the good thing that happened in the recent actuality is that we don't even need academics to say that. We see that actually in policy, 800 billion indeed are being unlocked for some aspects of what we could call military Keynesianism, right? It's again the state intervening in human affairs and in social affairs, but not for social welfare as in traditional social democratic institution of the 50s and 60s, but in new types of more belligerent policies. By the way, Emmanuel Macron has been very specific in mentioning also that this would not be done through taxing more. So we see that there is a very obvious class dimension to that and a very obvious political ideology that's associated to this militaro-Keynesianism. Now, the good news with respect to that first obstacle is that there is money. Now we can all agree that the funds are here, and now we can shift the debate to what do we do with those public funds that are being unlocked. And the good news is also that even Germany, for example, is getting away from the traditional ordo liberalism type of monetary frameworks and switching to other policies. The second one that I wanted to bring is that we need to renounce to the rhetoric of the trickle-down economics or growth as benefiting from general population, right? Because if we look at the last 50 years, there's been tremendous growth. If we look at the last 5 years, I was astonished this morning when I checked the S&P 500 5 years ago and today, it's roughly doubled. That's crazy. It's insane. The level of gain that has been achieved in recent years on the stock market or in recent decades in the economy as a whole is tremendous. And yet, most people are not benefiting from that. So the solution to achieve welfare and prosperity is not necessarily growth. It's more to do with how we distribute and redistribute within societies. And those are things that need to be said up front. The bad news about that is that when people feel that they've been betrayed for decades and that hospitals have been left in the dust and public transport system the same, and all sorts of social provisioning systems are being abandoned, they turn to skepticism towards elites. And typically we see that the AFD vote, for example, is extremely connotated to class situation and to people who are feeling left over in this austerity landscape. So the good news about that is that we know what these people want. They want, as Tim has very eloquently described, social provisioning, health, prosperity on the long run, security for their children, and things like that. And we can have the debate on how to bring that to them. The third point, and I'll try to be on time, has to do with geopolitics. So basically, as we know very well in this room, given the place that we're at, the European construction dating from the 40s and 50s has been done on two backgrounds: the dismantling of European colonial empires and the takeover of United States in funding the reconstruction after the suicidal world wars that Europe went through, right? So we've got the Marshall Plan, we've got the European Coal and Steel Community, we've got the ancestor of the OECD, and we've got NATO. Now we're at a crossroad. It's really interesting because if we think about post-growth, the people who will suffer the most in the 21st century are not the ones that are in the countries that benefited the most from growth, right? So there is now this geopolitical crossroad where we see Europe being challenged by the US, whereas over the last decades, Europe basically was, in terms of foreign policy, almost exclusively aligned to the US. And at the same time, we see that Europe, as a normative project, can embrace something much more centered on multilateralism, on diplomacy, as you said, Tim, on turning towards other parts of the world and delinking itself in terms of foreign policy from what we've seen on this alignment with the US over all these decades. So a step to do that would be, for example, to respect the ICC type of warrants of arrest, which we see is not to be taken for granted when we look at some European reactions. But now what I want to bring as a normative dimension is that we can dream of a Europe that's turning towards new partnerships, respecting countries from the global south, embracing multilateralism, embracing human rights, embracing migration rights, embracing war rights. And all of this needs to be done if we want to avoid the barbarism that the 21st century can be.
Thank you very much, Victor. And thank you also very much for bringing in the point that not only there must be balance, but also the political will. And the question is, for what do we have this political will? Secondly, thank you also for bringing up that if there is the perception society that there is no health and wealth, it's a big, big, big threat to our society. And I say the perception because also we see in Germany a lot of people, if you ask them directly, are you okay? Do you feel okay? They say yes. But then if you ask for the overall picture, they're saying, no, our economy is really bad. So there is a misunderstanding of how the actual situation is and how people think others perceive the situation. And it is also a threat to democracy. I mean, I'm from Germany and 20% for the AfD. It's a big task for all politicians that this should never happen again. Now, I will turn to Dr. Rutger Höxtra, who is online, and he is an associate professor at the Center for Environmental Sciences at the Leiden University. He leads the WISE Horizons project, which is a 4-year European project to develop metrics, accounting, and models for well-being, inclusion, and sustainability. He is also involved in the MERGE project and many other international initiatives, such as the UN Expert Group on Measuring Well-being. Rutger's research focuses on developing alternative well-being indicators that go beyond traditional GDP, examining the relationship between economic and environmental systems. And Rutger argues that the current Beyond GDP movement is fragmented and calls for a unified global community for well-being and sustainability. Rutger, I am pleased that you will share your insights on how these new indicators can help shift the focus and how a unified movement can be achieved. The floor is yours.
Yes, thanks very much. Can you just confirm that you can hear me and see the slides?
We can hear you and we can see the slides.
Excellent, thanks a lot. My apologies for not being there. Apparently the Dutch railways were also in disarray simultaneously with the Belgian railways. Today, I'd like to take you through this idea of how we could get to some more convergence and harmonization of the key concepts in our community. The projects that I'm involved in, the WISE Horizons and also MERGE, have a lot more to say than just the comments that I'll have today, but I'll refer to the websites in a moment. Now, I think it's fairly obvious for people why it might be important to actually have some more convergence on key concepts. But I just want to reiterate also what impact that had on the economic narrative in society. So this is a graph from my book from 2019, Replacing GDP by 2030, where I simply charted the number of countries that actually had national income measurements across the last century. And as you can see, if you go back to 1900, only 9 countries actually had a national income measurement in their history. And what really propelled this situation was that in 1953, the system of national accounts, which is a very complex economic accounting structure, was actually introduced. And very often stress that this then makes it possible to compare data between countries, for example. But I actually also think it has a huge linguistic and narrative impact on society when key concepts are actually formalized in some way. Now, this I tried to illustrate using this figure from the New York Times. So the New York Times also has a 100-year archive, electronic archive. And what you see on the left here is the share of articles that have a certain word or a certain term. And so you can see that the economy, the use of the word economy or the adjective economic actually increased during crises, and then it also reduces to a certain extent. But it is actually constantly going up. And surprisingly, in the Great Depression, for example, only 2% of articles actually had the word economy in them. And you can really see the impact of the SNA in this as well, because you can see that the term economic growth actually didn't really exist in the New York Times before the 1950s. And so actually having a system of national accounts with all these key concepts actually also contributed to the phrase economic growth actually being used in our societies, in our stories, in our conversations, and in our media. Now, what we all, I think probably many of you know, is that basically for the last 50 years, we have been developing many different ways of measuring beyond GDP, as we call it. So for 50 years, some of the most brilliant minds have been thinking about this topic, but have also been coining many different terms and terminologies to actually identify what we are trying to measure. And I do believe that underlying there is actually a bit of an informal harmonization of terminology taking place. Of course, many people still have many different types of terminology, but there is a convergence that's actually happening and that I want to illustrate a little bit. And interestingly, the convergence is even becoming evident in the system of national accounts. It was a bit under the radar. I don't know how many people in the audience actually realize this, but there was a new revision of the system of national accounts adopted 3 weeks ago in New York. And from some perspectives, it was quite revolutionary because in the second chapter, it actually refers to well-being and sustainability, which is a rather surprising second chapter for a system that's supposed to be measuring economic progress. And I think it's a great testament to all the thinkers that have been arguing to go beyond GDP, that actually the second chapter now has become influenced by this thinking. And I think these terms, well-being and sustainability, those are actually part of this convergence that is happening. And so what our research group has done in WISE Horizons specifically is try to look at all the measurement systems, well, not all of them, but a couple of dozen of them that are very influential, and try to chart them in 3 dimensions. So there's well-being of the current generation, sustainability of the future generation, and inclusion being the distribution of well-being. And it turns out actually that all of these measurement systems do measure one of these 3 dimensions, or sometimes 2, or sometimes even 3 of these dimensions. And I think it's also important that we then have nouns, so well-being, sustainability, and inclusion, but also the adjectives, so inclusive and sustainable. And just to illustrate maybe what some of you might be familiar with, if you look at the well-being space, you have, for example, the Human Development Index, life satisfaction, the U Index, benefits and costs experienced. And these are actually all well-being metrics that are using very different terminology, but they're basically all measuring the current quality of life of the people. They are just using different scientific foundations. So the capability approach, Kahneman's approach, life satisfaction measurement, and welfare economics. So they're actually just using different methodologies, but the measurement aim that they have is actually very similar. Now, in the space of sustainability, there are very different things as well. There's welfare economics that leads to comprehensive or inclusive wealth. And of course, the planetary boundaries, which was just described in terms of the donut economics, that's very much a sustainability view from a natural sciences perspective. So what is this is trying to illustrate is that although all this terminology might be very different, in essence, we are actually very much on the same page on what the dimensions are actually of this debate. So I'm feeling quite hopeful that hopefully we can also kind of converge towards using some of these terms. As I said, in the UN situation, the SNA 2025 is already adopting well-being and sustainability. The OECD has the WISE Center. In the European Commission, there's also the Sustainable Inclusive Wellbeing Initiative. And when we were collaborating as European Horizon projects, we also adopted this terminology as being, you know, a good summary of the things that we are trying to achieve when going beyond GDP. Of course, well-being economy aligns very long-time advocates for the well-being economy. I do want to stress one thing, because people often think that when you're saying convergence on terminology, that you also mean convergence on methodology. But I actually believe that having, you know, these various scientific schools of thought weighing in on the same phenomenon, but with different methodological approaches, that is actually really important. So I do think there's a good argument to be made to actually start convergence on terminology, but to be very interdisciplinary in terms of the methodologies that are there. And one final thing I'd like to say, I do actually believe that it's not just sufficient to have metrics of sustainable and inclusive well-being. I also believe that we need to really think beyond the system of national accounts. The system of national accounts is a very complex accounting structure. The system of national accounts 2025, I think, is good in the sense that it's also taking on board some of the ideas of the Beyond GDP community, but at the same time, it's not interdisciplinary enough. And I do think our Beyond GDP community should also be thinking about Beyond SNA to see whether we can actually create an interdisciplinary accounting structure that covers the various methodologies that we have here. And so finally, I'd just like to point you to the two websites of the two projects we're involved in, but there are many other great Horizon Europe projects. Happy to discuss. I hope I was within the 5 minutes.
Not really. I mean, we parliamentarians are used to speak in 1 minute, maximum 2 minutes. Here it's not the case, but I mean, we have to discuss so many important things. So it's also very difficult for me to say, you have now, your 5 minutes are up. So I'm sorry for that. Thank you very much, Rutger, for highlighting that we need, we converge the terminology, but we need differency in the methodology. And now I will turn to Dirk. Dr. Dirk Dembski is CEO of Curasan, a medical product company. And I'm very happy that now we had a lot of theory that we're now turning into real life insights and how our concepts can be put into practice? Can they or can't they? That's the question. So Dirk was, before joining Curaçao in January 2021, he used to serve Topcon Healthcare as managing director. There we also, Tim, have again the connection with health. Prior to his, he was appointed as executive managing director at Naton Medical, one of China's largest medtech companies, where he completed several acquisitions and built international businesses. Dirk can offer us a unique business perspective on sustainability and economic transformation and how sustainable prosperity can actually be achieved. In his doctoral dissertation, Dirk explored how competition, meaning collaboration between competitors, can be a strategic model to sustain innovation while shifting the focus from competition to cooperation and shared value creation. Dirk, I'm excited to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Manuela. Well, I'm not sure it's you. So I haven't developed any concepts. I haven't written any books about sustainability. So when I was invited, and thanks very much for having me, I asked myself, what can I contribute? And I think what I can contribute to the discussion here is to give you a bit of an idea what sustainability means for someone who's trying to live it every day, but having challenges with it. Because let's start with something very unpleasant. Companies, most companies I know, are not made for sustainability. They are made to grow the wealth of investors and shareholders. Unpleasant, but it is what it is. So that means for people like me, what we really look at day after day is our P&L. And when I now think about sustainability, and I do, I have children, and I'm not thinking about my own children, and I want this world really to become a better place. So how does that fit? Me looking at the P&L and doing things that support the P&L and trying to make a more sustainable business. The good news now is there's many things you can do as a company which are sustainable and support your P&L. I can give you a few examples just from our business. So the products we manufacture is all around tissue regeneration and tissue healing. A lot of that is chemical processes, and that's very energy intense. So a couple of years back, we decided to generate our own energy. On the one hand, to be independent from what happens, but also we believe that it contributes to sustainability. So what we have seen is it helps the P&L, but it also does something with the people working with the company, and it does something with our customer base. It's a very holistic view at it, and this is to me, a very good example where you can serve sustainability and can serve your P&L as well. Employee well-being is another good example of where it's easy for every company to be more sustainable. And again, it helps your P&L because the war for good people, the war for talents as we call it out there, is incredibly intense. It's so difficult to find good people out there. So sometimes it's a very simple thing. So no, it's not abstract at all. I think the best investment we have done 2 years ago was investing in a very professional kitchen in the company. I see you smiling now, but believe it or not, people love to come together at lunchtime, cook together, and when you talk about these things in hiring situations, you see the reaction with people. They like that idea. So again, simple little things you can do, which are good in terms of sustainability, but also help your business. Another example I was probably... So our business is medical. And medical is a question of innovation. Because people always want to go for the best care they can get. And so that's why companies like us are constantly innovating. And what also happens in our industry very often is that we go for single-use solutions, because no one wants to use a medical device with different patients. Everyone's afraid of disease transmission or whatsoever. So when we think about innovation, we very much think about how we can reduce the waste coming with single use. And again, there's products coming out of that innovation channel which are good for society, but also good for the business. So I think, bottom line, what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't have to be complicated, it doesn't have to be abstract. If you want, you can do many, many good things as a company in terms of sustainability. But now when I talk to people in the company or peers from other companies, so very often this becomes a moment of, oh yeah, that's a good idea, we never thought about it. And then they go back and they stop thinking about it. So when I was invited here, I thought, it's a bit unusual, these conferences, being invited as an industry CEO. But then I said, that's exactly what needs to happen. And that's exactly what should happen with many of my peers. Because politics and academics alone will come up with brilliant concepts and great ideas, but someone needs to live it every day. And that's why people like me should be here. So again, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Dirk, also for reminding us of that simple little things are not only helping society, but also helping our economy. And I'd like to thank you also for staying within in 5 minutes. So, very good. Now, Tim gave us already an amazing keynote speech, but he was not properly introduced. So I would like to do that in 2 minutes' time. I'm German, I have to stick to introducing everybody. Tim is a British economist and a leading thinker in sustainable development. As a professor at the University of Surrey and director of the Centre for Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, he critically examines the concept of perpetual economic growth. His book, Prosperity Without Growth, was translated into 18 languages worldwide and named Financial Times Book of the Year in 2010. In 2016, Tim was awarded the Hillary Laureate of Exceptional International Leadership in Sustainability, as well as other prizes such as the Eric Sansi Prize for Economics in 2022. In addition to his academic work, Tim is an award-winning dramatist with numerous radio writing credits for the BBC. Tim, I would like now to hear your thoughts very shortly, what the panelists just said, and then I will turn to questions.
Yeah, I wasn't really expecting to do that, and I don't think I need to. In some ways, I'd rather go to the audience. Again, thank you for doing my publicity work for me. I think that's wonderful. I just wanted to say very briefly, Sirpa very kindly introduced the book. I do have, and she mentioned that I probably don't get any money for it, I actually have some pieces of paper which allow 40% off that book and ensure that I get absolutely nothing from it. So I would just put that little piece out there as an advert, and I'd much rather go to questions. I'm fascinated by the contributions. I think they've given us excellent insights and some challenges, Dirk. Thank you very much for that. And I think I would rather hear some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Tim, because we actually are over now with our panel, but I think 15 minutes of coffee break is much too much. We should look first into questions, and I would like to know if somebody here in the room would like to address a question, and then possibly I would like to take a question online. So please, I know the first one is always difficult, but just raise your hand. Here we see somebody in front. Introduce maybe shortly yourself and then your question.
Stientje van Veldhoven. I'm actually on a different panel later on, so I'll probably get a reverse question. And Tim, thanks so much for your presentation. When you showed your slide of, let's say, jobs in relation to CO2 emissions, you saw that the sectors that are actually high in terms of jobs and high in terms of CO2 are the private sector, whereas most of the jobs, let's say, in the lower corner that you pointed we should go towards are more public sector or public sector related. So my question then is, how do you combine, and you gave the indication that these other sectors should move towards that corridor. But also thinking about Europe, right, the very essence of the company is of course to ensure that there's enough income to actually maintain the company and maintain the confidence of investors. What, in your view, is the way in which we can marry those two things, bringing the private sector more to that quadrant without, while still acknowledging what the private sector is about, to be able to also pay for, of course, all of those public services that are so critical in ensuring that well-being in that quadrant where you think the economy should go to?
Yeah, thank you. Very astute question. Not a trivial or easy one to answer. The way that I presented that graph was already, in economic terms, was a little bit rebellious, because I presented as good the idea that people want jobs. Actually, the incentive from the point of view of the enterprise actually is to reduce the labour content so far as that's possible. And so what counts in terms of those professions which are very, very labour intensive is the opposite of what economists praise in society, which is labour productivity and growth in labour productivity in particular. It's growth in labour productivity that gives us, when it happens, it hasn't been happening much recently, that gives us growth. And so all of those professions towards that right-hand end are nasty professions from a conventional economic point of view. Now, I point that out there are ways of going, I could say a lot about the detailed solutions to it, but I point it out really because I see it continually still as if not the core challenge of creating coherence around the care economy, is that there are activities that involve people's time. That means they are labour rich, they are labour intense, and they carry out vital relational tasks. And those tasks contribute to our well-being, but they are second or third cousins in the conventional economic model precisely because they involve that time. So there are a couple of ways to think about how we address that challenge. One is to say we just do less time in those jobs, and there are good and bad ways of doing that. So, for example, the use of AI in some online consulting for triaging medical conditions in the health sector possibly is a good thing to do, because it's actually much more efficient than the ways that things can be done if you have to line up at your doctor's surgery for hours at a time, even when you can get an appointment, and you can get the same answer very quickly. Other things, the caring for people, the time that's intense in that, is very, very difficult to substitute for. And so it's a question not just of being able to see where you can substitute and where you can't substitute, but for finding fiscal mechanisms through which the places where you gain efficiency in the economy can then be used to create the wealth that you need with it to pay for people's time. Ultimately, it is and this is an agenda which I think is highly important within the labour movements. It is about protecting the time that people have to spend in the economy to do the jobs that are absolutely necessary. A second way of thinking, just very, very quickly, is that you don't give over those tasks unnecessarily to financial and economic structures which extract profits out of them for the interest purely of the shareholders, particularly when that's underwritten by the public purse. So if you give all of your money into for caring for elderly people to private equity companies who own offshore accounts and send profit to their shareholders that way, you're basically squeezing the labour out of those tasks because it's a cost to those profits. You're reducing the quality of care, and you're reducing your tax take on the activities. So the reorganisation of that, the socialisation of those activities, even if they happen in the private sector, and the structuring of them really, really matters. It's the design, the devil is in the design and the detail. But those are the strategies that I think we have to think about if we want to protect that care economy.
Dirk, do you want shortly to come in? Or?
Difficult to add something to this now. Well, I think, Tim, was also very important when we discussed these things in the financial sector. We discussed about that before. Depending where the money is coming from, it makes a very big difference in how much freedom you have to look into sustainable measures. I have been working with publicly listed companies. I've been working for private equity. Now company I'm working for is owned by a family office. And that's a completely different story. Because with these people, you can talk about all these things, whereas when you work in a publicly listed company, you have your quarterly investor meetings, and really no one cares about these things. It's key performance indicators, and that's why I think unless you restructure the whole system and implement different key performance indicators, things won't change. That's not changing from the inside. That can only be changed from the outside.
Thank you, Dirk. Victor, very shortly, then we turn to the question online.
Yes, right. I'd like to rebound on that because I think that we need to break two dichotomies that we tend to do. The first one is private solution versus public solution. And I don't mean that as saying fluffy stuff like we need all actors at the table. I mean that by saying that if we leave the regulatory and legal structures that are currently determining how businesses operate as they are, businesses are trapped, of course, because they are hostages to shareholder type of structures and to P&L imperatives. And the family office type of companies that you just described, Dirk, are disappearing. More and more, we are having super shareholders. If you look at the BlackRocks and the Vanguards and the Fidelity of the world, I used to be a trader, by the way, so I know a bit about it. Those guys, basically the shareholder structure is super fragmented. So you have some sort of black boxes. You don't even know who's behind, and therefore you cannot go and do some shareholder activist type of activities as easily as in family offices. And there's a concept for that which is called asset manager capitalism by people like Benjamin Brown and Daniela Gabor, and I encourage you to read about it because it's kind of the new legal structure of capitalism. So if we break the dichotomy and say the state should intervene not only in directing all of the economy, I think there is good case for having some state planning, but also in setting more proper business structure and more proper financing flows, as you just said. And we are having Triodos Bank later to discuss also ethical banking and alternative banking and different shareholder structure, or even cooperatives, employee cooperatives and economic democracy type of concepts. Then we go beyond the we're all trapped in shareholder type of vampirism and traps. And the second thing, super briefly, I also think that we need to perhaps not oppose too much people in academic that do only theory and people in business that do all the practical stuff, because of course many people in academia are also doing their studies based on lots of interview, ethnographies, or people like me who used to be in the private sector and then switched to academia. So those are the two dichotomies that I would encourage to.
I just said that to defend myself being here.
Sorry?
I just said that to defend myself being here.
No, you don't have to defend yourself being here. And I think it's great that we.
And Dirk actually supervises his PhD students, don't you, Dirk?
Oh yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, there you go.
So we will first have a question online, and thank you for Roland-Jan to speaking it out. Then we will turn to your question. Please, Roland-Jan.
Yes, I have two questions for you, Tim. I know I'll read them out and you can probably reply to them or answer them together. These are from Christiana Isaac Izoya, who's from the University of Applied Sciences in Bingen. And she asks, thank you for your insightful presentation on the care economy. It's true that there are many challenges in this area. Do you have any suggestions or ideas on how to prioritize care, focusing on the economy and business? And then her second question is, you mentioned something about a new Europe embracing either war rights or world rights. If you mean war rights, wouldn't that contradict the first speaker's discussion on sustainability in the care economy? I'm not sure if that's a question for you, by the way.
That doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, I think that.
Is that your question?
I think so.
Okay, well there you go. It wasn't specified in the question.
So the first question was really just about finding ways to prioritize care in the private sector. I mean, I think the starting point for that for me, I mean, we talked about it a little bit before, but the starting point for that for me is to figure out, what care is. Care, to some extent, is that restorative principle that brings us back to health. This is a tricky one, Dirk. And, I confessed to Dirk before that I'd actually been a beneficiary, I think that's the right word, of the kinds of products that Kurasan produces at a certain point in my life. and they are materials that support the regrowth of bone where it needs to be supported. And so, you know, if you're kind of in an accident or in some kind of medical procedure, or if you have a dental implant, any of those things, actually, you know, you are a beneficiary of the sorts of things that Dirk has been talking about. And that companies, that sort of medical products, I mean, they're good things in the sense that they improve the quality of people's lives. But I just put this down as a challenge because, you know, if I think about my own case, I wish I knew what I knew before about care and about prevention, in particular about what I knew about food and health, before I indulged in the kinds of things that led me to the point where I needed medical procedures. Because the medical procedure that you need at that point is down the line. The care principle pushes us up line to ask, how do you prevent the need for some of those things in the first place? And that's a horrendous conflict in the private sector, unless within the leadership of that private sector, you can begin to ask the question, if I was really trying to put human health as the output measure of my product, rather than the return to the family in this case, or the return to the shareholders, where would I invest? Where in the preventive stream from the beginning to the end of that medical problem would I end up investing? And is it possible to think of the private sector as doing both those things? Yes, a legitimate response to the emergency need for medical procedures that improve the quality of our lives at one end, but also engaging in the causal mechanisms in the system that are leading us to that point on the other. So could a company like Curaçao, could it actually think, well, why do people need dental implants, for example? It's because our diets are overloaded, and I come back to my own particular case, with sugar. And that means that you get dental decay at rates that are not sustainable in the economy as a whole. So in a sense, does Curaçao look at that and say, if health is our outcome, should somewhere we be engaging with that over-obesogenic, over-addictogenic environment and creating the kinds of solutions that would prevent the need for the products on which we are basing our profit strategies. Now, I know how challenging that is, Dirk, but I do think that there are cases, and you sort of mentioned one of them, where you know there are some win-wins. There are some preventive measures that you can engage in, even when you're a product and output-oriented company, that are supportive of your general aim to be in business, which I think most people in business aim to serve society. And asking the question, how do you serve society best within the private sector, does allow for a little bit of questioning of the output measure on which you measure success. Is it the number of those medical implants that you sell, or is it actually the reduction in human harm, in the harm to human health, that should be the output measure?
Very good. I will now turn to you, who has a question here in the room, and I also would like to involve a little bit the speakers online.
There's one question.
One question for Victor. Okay, sorry, Victor, then please.
Sure.
Short, because our coffee time is already up in 2 minutes.
I really respect your coffee time, so I'll try to be super short. The question is about whether there's a contradiction between saying there should be a right regarding war and at the same time to target care economy. I think no, absolutely not, because care economy is a normative project. Is where tendentially we should strive to go as societies. Whereas what I was meaning as we should promote rights around warfare, it means humanitarian law that regulates warfare, that tells you cannot do anything, especially against civilian populations. You cannot starve populations and things like that. And I think, therefore, that these regulatory aspects of warfare are things that are needed in the short term, because whether we like it or not, there are armies on the globe, then they do dirty stuff, and we need to set rules on how these things should happen, or at least limit the damage that they do, and to keep in mind the normative project of going in a better direction of care economy. And I could say right now, yeah, let's all do peace and let's all promote that there is no army tomorrow, but that would be a very empty statement. So I would be pro being a bit more realist than that.
Thank you, Victor, also for being short. Please.
On planetary boundaries, my name is Gert-Jan Storm. I represent the civil society initiative supporting the implementation of the European Biodiversity Partnership through the research network Biodiversity Plus. I just would like to have a confirmation that when we talk about planetary boundaries, the reference is the Earth Systems Boundaries Approach, September 2024, about a safe and just approach to the issue. Initially, planetary boundaries refer to the concept of a safe operating space for humanity in 2009, with 3 high-risk issues, and now we are in a situation with the latest analysis of well beyond 6. And the reason to refer to risk is that it provides a bridge to talk about public policy in terms of prevention and precaution, for instance, in central banking.
Thank you very much. Rutger and Xiaoting, could you hear the question and would you like to react? Please, Rutger, start.
Yeah, just to react quickly. I think in the figure that I showed, this triangle back there, it's the planetary boundaries concept with the 6 out of the 9 being transgressed. I think the point I was trying to make there is that, you know, these are, for example, in academia, quite important topics, and in some cases also in some policy settings. But I do think it would be valuable for these kind of things to be incorporated into, you know, measurement systems and decision-making tools more broadly. So, for example, in the SNA process, so in the system of national accounts process, it was talked about the planetary systems, but there is really no effort to integrate kind of economic measurement and the planetary boundaries. And I do think it's quite important to do that. I do want to make one final point is that I do think, like, you know, measurement and all those things are only important if they're really made and make a contribution to decisions by actors, by companies, by governments. And from that perspective, I think our community has created many different decision-making tools and models and frameworks. But I would still like to argue that I think we would be far more powerful if we actually galvanized a lot of that thinking into some more coherent type of approach, rather than you know, having very different ones that all the expert, I think we all know kind of the similarities between all these things that we're mentioning today. But I do feel we need to make an additional effort to really galvanize everything that we've learned in the last 50 years towards something more coherent for media and for society.
Thank you, Rutger. Xiaoting, would you like to come in?
Yeah, so yeah, it's indeed looking at this. We're already transgressing 6 planetary boundaries, and the country's responsibility and their footprint in transgressing those boundaries also differ. And that really is a hard look at, just reflecting on Tim's really great graph on job versus carbon. You actually can look at all those sectors and think job versus biodiversity degradation, freshwater withdrawal. And then you also have a really different picture to think about what is actually your policy intervention. So for example, the tech and finance part, as Tim mentioned, there's this obsession of thinking about addressing in the climate change with those tech and finance, but then you also ignore the massive factor that a lot of the new tech require massive freshwater withdrawal, massive material use, material footprints. And those then give you another angle to think about where are some of the really great, like the pinpoint that you really need to move, and the sectors that can give you regenerative potential for other planetary boundaries. So that's already a good kind of starting point. And I just want to kind of come back to think about how then I love, Tim, I would love to hear more about how that kind of different areas with the food production and manufacturing moving to that care economy, and thinking that how we structure those sectors, how do we make it more regenerative and distributive by design, and looking at all different holistically the planetary boundary, and that come to more preemptive policy making. And that's when we look at all the well-being economy, governments who have been doing some of the policy is the big transition coming from just reactive policy making to preemptive policy making. And that you can already see really great example in health, how in Wales, for example, they're looking at preemptive health and how that can actually bring the care together, but also bring in other things of how do you get the public to go into nature, the access to green space, and that bring in thinking about the linkage with other planetary boundary. So preemptive policy is very important, and that preemptive policy thinking then can help you gear towards more public and private partnership in a way that help you have more businesses that's actually helping with a preemptive approach. So that come to kind of community wealth building, for example, thinking about in a place what type of community, what type of business you actually attract. And then it comes to some of the speakers already talked about how do we look at what type of business is fit for purpose for the future of sustainability with prosperity. And that has a lot of the deep design. What we work with 500 different businesses, thinking about the deep design, who owns the business, how the business is governed, what's the network, what is finance, what's the purpose. And you can see, for example, the Spanish government already is thinking about how their policy can ensure employers has more say in government, in the governance of businesses, and that bring in more kind of embedding the employment into the business design and get away from more of the traditional models of thinking just maximizing shareholder profits. So all this, I think it's already happening, some of the really good policies. And if we shift our focus from GDP to care economy or border prosperity, then we find there's actually different business model, different finance model that we really need to elevate through our more preemptive public policy.
Thank you very much, Zhao Ting. And I would like to thank all the panelists. And unfortunately, I have to conclude this panel. We're way over time. Thank you so much for all your contributions. I think it's very difficult to wrap up, but to have some keywords in mind that also for the next discussions that we in a way need the right balance. We have to stay in balance to get society on board, but we also need very much the political will to change things. That is why it's so important that we did this conference here today in the European Parliament. And in order to go into the right direction, I think we also need to rearm Europe with values. So thank you very much for all of you, and we will turn now to the next panel.
Okay, the topic of the second panel is, okay, now we know where we should be heading in general level. Okay, how to finance it. And in finance, of course, there's the debate, as you know, that the capitalism is just a failed game. You just can't fix it because of the incentives. But then again, and I'm the economist myself, is, well, who creates the incentives? And if we figure out together what is the right incentivizing mechanism in the economy, yes, the business will do it, because the market economy is beauty. It does what is profitable. But if you make wrong things to be profitable, don't complain about the companies of doing it, what you incentivize for, and vice versa. If you ask the economy and companies to be sustainable, geared towards care economy, saving the environment and being preventive in all the problems, please do incentivize that. So in theory, this is simple, isn't it? But let's go a bit more on the details of this panel, what this really means and how you do it. There are a couple of these kind of claims that I would like to put on the table. The problem is not a financing gap, but mislocated capital, as we heard in the first panel. Oh boy, we do not miss, or we do not have the lack of money. The worth of private investments that is turned around every year is about 70 trillion euros. Trillion is millions, a lot of zeros, a lot of money. And only 2% of that is truly and documented way put in sustainable investments. And as far as we know, almost half, roughly 40%, is disincentivized so it goes to fossil fuels, for example. It's very profitable to invest our pension funds on Exxon, Shell, and so forth. Okay, so how do we fix that? Then capital markets must serve the purpose. They are not that kind of a blind eye, not just the scale. It is not only growing the economy, the question how you grow. Then the question is, what is the role of the public finance? We can't sort of incentivize the private business and investors to go on the wrong direction and then ask our national budgets and EU budgets to fix the problem. But there is a role for public money. It can be a huge, besides the regulation, pull effect. This is, as we talked about the measurement, how you measure about your public budgets. Are you actually incentivizing fossil fuels there too, in your subsidy systems? Or are you incentivizing renewables? What are European Investment Bank and the other financial sources doing? Are they serving for the purpose? Do we have the measurement? Do we have the information that is adequate to make right decision? So we need to equip the institutions with the mandate for the transition. And we need to create accountability, a bit like in accounting. You need to know what is the impact. You have the balance sheets, you have accounting systems, you have IFRS, you have national accounting systems, you have all that in place. That needs to be also in social and in environmental matters. Then there's a lot of other issues, but I really don't want to empty all the questions.
We don't have to do anything anymore.
A bit you need to solve the problem. I'm just sort of laying down the problem on the table. Because now we have a very excellent panel to discuss all this. And on the panelists, we start with Benoît Lallemand. Welcome, very happy to have you here. Finance Watch is doing a great work in sustainability and in other fields about how the financial systems in Europe work. So you'll start a bit of the bigger picture, and then Hans Stegeman, I hope I pronounce your name right, about how the incentivizing systems would need to go when it goes to private sector. You are coming from Triodos Bank, a long track on activities to try to improve the sustainable finance. And Sara Liva-Tsovic, who's a scientist, external government programs on Dow, about how you as a business see what you need to make things better and what kind of thresholds there is. And last but not least, Frank Van Schot, director from Counterbalance, on summarizing everything up and putting the challenges for us in the table. So let's, with the timetable, go quickly to the panels. Start with the Benoît, and I won't have any in-between introductions. I sort of took time to introduce all of you at once. Benoît, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Very happy to be here, and I think you set the scene quite in detail, so that will save me a bit of time, I think. So the question we want to address, I think, on this panel is how to make finance serve sustainable prosperity. I think in responding to that question, you can go in the more technical way or the more political way, right? And within the technical, there's really the micro, the nitty-gritty of sustainable finance regulation. There's a bit of a macro picture, which was also discussed this morning, and then so I'll focus a bit more on the macro and the political dimension. I will mention that my brilliant colleagues make in-depth analysis and policy recommendations about all the nitty-gritty of sustainable finance, so please, and public finance as well. So please check our website, because the material is really to be used by a crowd like this one. So now the macro perspective. And I think the organizers have put together a very coherent, useful program where to look at the macro picture. So first listening to the science, as we did this morning, in a civilized region, this should be the starting point and the foundation for any policy. So then we'll be discussing after this panel, new economic models, because it's clear, and we already heard it this morning, the current economic system is actually not doing the job. And then there's our question about the financing mechanism. And frankly, it's the easiest of all, this question. There's always a big drama about finance is complex, etc. It should be the easiest of all. And as we know, money is a social construct. So again, you can do everything you want to do, like building this building, etc., without any money, of course, or you can print all the money you need. It's a social construct, so it has social consequences, but again, it's easy. The energy, material, CO2 molecules, you can negotiate with those, so that's much more difficult. And so we've heard the science tells us we're in trouble because of climate change, biodiversity, ecosystems destruction, so we know that whole thing. So I think there are two elements to the challenge. One is the scale and the volume of financing, and then there's the complexity of the challenge. And for both reasons, my point really about the macro is that you need to reorganize the three pillars of the financial system, which are fiscal policy and public finance, monetary policy and what its role is, and then indeed financial markets and private finance. And we've heard about papers by Gabor and Brown, who will advocate that given the complexity and the scale of the challenge, you need basically, to make the point directly, a much more dominant fiscal policy and government spending and intervention, and giving a direction to private capital, disciplining private capital, and monetary in support of fiscal policy. Where today, as you might know, and we are stuck in these discussions, we have been for already 14 years actually, that finance which exists, financial markets are actually the name of the game, and they dominate the whole financial system. So that's because of the scale, but again, about the complexity. So we've heard it's a deep transformation of the economy we need. So it's not just a bit more capital for renewables, a bit less for fossil fuels. That's not going to work. And by the way, I always like to remind people, if you look at energy historians, they will tell you there has never been an energy transition in history, right? So it's actually a marketing argument created by the nuclear lobby. As we know, sources of energy accumulate. So we've never burned more wood or more coal than today, and they all pile up, right? And there's a thin layer of green at the top. So it's not just about developing this one; it's about reducing the whole pyramid. So that's a massive challenge, and you understand immediately why private markets won't do that. They're quite anarchical, and they don't have a plan for society. I think you don't want them to have a plan for society, frankly. You don't want to see that being realized. So in a nutshell, and we published a report last year looking at the amount of money and where you find the money. So we can talk about the hundreds of billions, right? There are different measures. It is in the hundreds of billions, at least possibly $500 billion a year for many decades, just for climate adaptation and mitigation. You can break that down, but that's the sort of lower scale. So that gives you an order of magnitude. We've made an estimation that even if the Savings and Investment Union works, you probably heard about it, it's a great new vehicle, well, new name, but very old project. Even if that works, and there are fundamental political barriers, so I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it working. If it works 100%, like a super success story, we estimate that covers maximum 30% of the financing needs, right? Just because of the mechanics of how financial markets allocate capital and profitability, etc. Which means you're left with, almost 70% of the envelope that needs then to be covered by public finance. And I think with the support of monetary policy, you should advocate. So I'm not going to go into that whole discussion. We have new fiscal rules since last year, which is basically a straitjacket on how much government can spend. They are completely not fit for purpose, as reality shows. So you have COVID, you need to suspend them. Now you have a so-called threat of war, you need to suspend them again, etc. So we really need to look at, as part of the discussion of financing, to really make these fiscal rules fit for purpose in the long term. And I think on that point, again, economists and scientists tell us any euro you invest today saves you many euros down the line. So we now have economic models, they're being improved, and academia is helping to improve what is called the damage function, which is basically how you assess the cost of climate change down the road, right? The impact on the economy. Now, I'm afraid central banks have made progress, so they are going beyond the old basic models, but they are still way behind in terms of really assessing the real cost. In terms of fiscal policy, we don't even do that. So you have the NGFS on central banks, which tells banks, hey, wait a second, fossil fuel exposures will create potential loss, We should also do that as part of the fiscal rules to really make the case. And I think this is a political argument we should be using, that again, investing now in mitigating climate change and adaptation, again, is a frugal attitude. It's a conservative attitude. You should do it to save fiscal capacity down the road, right? So I think this argument, rather than the ethical, do good or save the planet argument in this day and age, will go a long way. So really the risk, in French we say the good household responsible attitude, which we call for, which is again a very conservative, frugal attitude. And so let me make a couple of more points. I see time is passing back. Okay, now the political dimension, and I was really happy to hear Sirpa and Tim and others making these very political points this morning, so I will skip some of them. Yeah, I think the political environment is very difficult. And to be honest, it was mentioned this morning, I'm quite horrified myself by all the warmongering going on. And I thought you can't say that because so loud is the ideological pressure these days. So I was very grateful for you, Sirpa, and also for Tim to make the case that, of course, diplomacy is the way, the same way that investing now in adaptation and mitigation saves you money down the road. The same way if you were invested in diplomacy instead of weapons, you would prevent conflicts, solve conflicts. And we talk about finance, it's much cheaper, right? So if you pay a diplomat 250K a year, which is quite generous, on average, you get 4 for each basic missile, right? If you move to tanks or long-range missiles, you get tens of them, right? If you talk about planes, all of a sudden you have an army of diplomats and negotiators that you can send around the globe. And very seriously, because now I'll talk about competitiveness just to finish, because of course competitiveness and strategic autonomy mixed together are the mantra of our EU political leaders that they're framing for their high-level discussions they're having now every 10 days or so. That's what you would need. You would need people to go and negotiate deals all over the place because we are interdependent on this planet anyway. And so we would need to invest much more in that. And again, it's much cheaper than rebuilding European armies, I think. And so the last crucial point I want to make is that I think the whole sustainability agenda, but also this very specific way that Europe goes about regulating markets, I think is actually our competitive edge. There was an article in DFT 2 weeks ago making the case that the sort of Trump clique, when they say Europe should deregulate, it's not so much because they want access for their champions, because as you realize, the US champions are all over the place already. It's because they know that, again, the real Europe competitive edge it's the way to do, to tame markets to some extent, and have more sustainable prosperity and the social cohesion that goes with it, etc. And that they actually really fear that. And so I think, in a nutshell, our leaders right now are making a big mistake in sort of starting to pay lip service to that, if not abandoning sustainability. I've heard we're not abandoning sustainability, but still, that's a bit in terms of political priorities. Unfortunately, it as Sirpa said, it has taken a second or third priority. And again, I think it's a mistake even from a competitiveness point of view. And then the last word I promise is about simplification. Of course, we are all for simple rules, right? Everyone is for simple rules. And I will tell you who's not for simple rules, right? I've been 14 years of financial advocating financial reform. The large corporations, and I can talk about the financial lobby, and Sirpa can tell you horror stories about that. They don't want simple rules because simple rules are effective. And then they give a direction to market, they discipline market, and they don't want that. And they have an army of lawyers that they can send to this building to make sure we have enough exemptions, enough loopholes, because then they have an army of compliance officers as well that can check all these boxes. So I find it quite hypocritical and frankly absurd and difficult to swallow that the same ones are now saying we want simplification. So I can give you very simple rules to regulate the financial system, like the leverage ratio, separating banking activities, etc. It's a few paragraphs on a piece of paper, and it works. So a few ideas to start building a counteroffensive to this political momentum.
Thank you, Benoit. And then let's move to Hans.
Yes, thank you. For those who don't know, Triodos Bank is a sustainable bank and active in a few European countries. And for the last 45 years, all we've been doing is what this is all about, trying to finance a more sustainable world, finance transitions as we call it, since a few years, but it is all the same. and I want to restrict myself to private finance. And thank you, Benoit, because there's a lot of points that I completely agree with, and it always has to fit in the bigger picture. Also for us, also given the panel this morning, you cannot say finance should do anything if there's no real economy that delivers sustainability. So it always goes hand in hand. But it is not to say, what some people in finance say, that yeah, we just finance real economic activity and say it's non-normative or it's objective. No, that's also not the case. And I think that's what we do differently than a lot of other bankers that say, hey, it's just about risk and return and that's all we do. No, it is also about what you choose to finance. And that brings me also to the last bit of the panel, the previous panel, that was about balance. And I thought, yeah, the economy is about balance, but what is definitely about balance sheets is the financial sector. And there is something strange also with regulation, but also how people think about sustainable finance. You already mentioned the finance gap. There is no finance gap, there's an allocation problem, and there is no clear connection between real economic activity and finance. And that is a problem if you want to talk about sustainable finance. Because if you look at the big capital flows over the last years, it's mostly secondary markets, mostly listed, which is completely unclear what the effect on the real economy is. And if you look at all that regulation that has been going on and concentrated mostly on that part, on sustainable capital flows, where you don't know what the impact actually is on the real economy, you can question yourself, is this a solution for whatever problem? Although we also lobbied for it, of course, because we want to have regulation in place, but you can question if you look from a distance, and I think now it's time also to look a little bit, we're here now, a little bit at the distance. Is this the best way? I try to explain it in two ways. Not being too technical, hopefully, but one is money creation. When does a private bank create money? Only when it sees a
big round of applause for the guy.
Really? Yeah, I completely agree. When a
he was talking about like simplification.
Well, okay. Okay.
Can you mute yourself, Jan?
I already muted him.
Okay.
But if he wants, it's also okay. I was talking about money creation. So if money creation is only for risk-return considerations and not for any limits, ecological limits, or about real economic activity, it's hard to claim on the balance sheet, because I was talking on the balance sheet, what that part of finance is doing for sustainability. On the other hand, we have a lot of finance for finance, asset price inflation, as we already discussed, which is doing nothing in the real economy, but is showing up as sometimes sustainable finance flows, which is quite strange. So we have to think about it, how we can do that better. And this is urgent, and we can think about it in two ways. We can easily start, and this is also, there are very much easy solutions, of course, so on the liability side of the balance sheet, because it's very simple to see what harmful activities are financed. So in terms of what you can do, it's better to start there than on the sustainability side. And especially now, and you also talked about where we are now, the competitiveness compass, it's very strange that on the one hand you say circular economy, energy transition are very important. However, we also kill with the omnibus a lot of regulation, which will definitely hurt also startups, new initiatives that cannot be financed. So there's also a strange thing going on. So becoming a little bit practical, what can you do now, given the time we're in? I'm still favoring brown asset ratios, to start on the brown side. I still think single sets of data, really accessible public data that helps to see the impact of every investing, so not only on the green side. Also thinking securitization is also, again, a big part. It doesn't help anything. It only leads to intermediation and less responsibility in capital flows. And the point also Frank Elson raised yesterday in the Financial Times, yes, if you skip regulation, it leads to more risk, credit risk for the financial sector. So leave all those non-performing loans that are there at the responsibility of the financial sector. That's the only way to make up for the lack of regulation. And yet, to end up with, yeah, this is the way to stay in balance, but it's definitely not enough. So.
Thank you, Hans. And by the way, did you know that the Commission is planning to come up with securitization regulation to lax it up?
Yeah, that's why
so
I said
actually,
yeah.
we are going on wrong direction, like with the omnibus here, here too. Then, Sarah,
Sure,
from
thank
the
you.
perspective of Dow, please.
Yes, thank you, Silva, for having me here, and maybe a bit of an introduction to put in the context. So Dow is a global multinational science company, material science company. So we operate in 98 sites in more than 30 countries. We've been around 125 years. You can count how many administrations, presidents, parliaments, governments that is to survive for that long. And I think that the only way to survive is to innovate, is to adapt and to mitigate. Now, half of that time we are in Europe, 60 years. So we are celebrating this year 60 years in where I am, Dow Benelux in Terneuzen, which is only 100 kilometers away, although it seems more with the traffic. So why did Dow, to kind of come back to this discussion, why did we invest 60 years ago in Terneuzen? Why did we come there? The infrastructure was there, the access to the sea and the law towards to the inland was there, regulations was there, the market was there, the pool was there. Would that be the case today? I think it's a difficult question to answer. So now looking into what does it take to have successful investments? Because, and I'll talk more about public investments, because you need to understand that internally we need to fight for capital, right? So we need to decide where are we going to invest. And the capital is not infinite, right? It's a limited capital. So we need a viable business case to say we are going to invest, like we did 60 years ago in Terneuzen. So we need a viable business case to make that investment commercially viable. So that's not just the public support, like the funding. That's very much appreciated and very much needed, but it's not the only thing that needs to come in place so that nobody wants to build a plant to shut it down after 10 years, right? Even if with the OPEX support for public investments, that's not the goal, right? You want to be able to operate for as long as you can. So then what does it need to be done to say we have a business case we're going to invest here, besides, of course, the financial aspect? Regulations. Derek, you mentioned the energy efficiency you were implementing in your company. So the regulations to make that energy efficiency or the project that you need to have internally to make that viable and not to increase the cost for us for that investment. So we need regulations to work in a way. I know you have you mentioned simplification. The simplification we are asking for is not to remove regulation from the context, but look at it as a whole. So what kind of regulation? They need to be simplified, they need to be harmonized in a way that help us bring that business case to reality. There needs to be a market and demand pool. So we serve almost all markets. We serve consumers, we serve packaging, we serve infrastructure, we serve mobility. So this carpet that sticks to the floor, the paint on the wall, your clothes, Tim, you mentioned health, the gloves, the clothing, we serve all these markets. We help our customers down the value chain to achieve their sustainable growth. So we need all of that to be able to, in the end, have that return on investment. So that's internal one. Then the regulations to be simplified to allow us to do that. So we have multiple projects, even today, in this time and day, with the whole financial and market constraints, we are still investing. We have numerous projects across the globe. We have building of the first net zero cracker in Canada that It made it possible because of the public investments, because of the incentives that we received there, that made it massive investments. We have numerous projects around the world for circular feedstocks. So, the saying, somebody's garbage, not another person's gold. We need that waste. Waste is a valuable feedstock for us. But we need the regulations to be in place to allow us to use that feedstock, to make valuable products. We also heavily invest into low carbon, circular biosolutions. So, and again, to be there for 125 years, you need to work together with the governments, with the society, with the market, again, as a whole, to basically, again, to have that investment. We talk about competitiveness, that means innovation. You need to bring something new to the market, you need to bring something, new process or new technology. So we really valuable a dialogue between all the stakeholders to make that happen.
Thank you, Sarah. And now directly to Frank.
Thank you. So I will talk mostly about the role of public funding, public loans, like the role of European Investment Bank in a just transition. But maybe I want to quickly connect with some earlier remarks that were made, because I think it's really helpful. And that is that actually, like, democratically speaking, because you talk about money creation and lending, etc., even all this private money is our money. Because no private bank, no BNP Paribas with a 2,000 billion euro balance sheet or whatever can make one single loan if the government does not accept this bank as being able to create loans. And so all of its wealth, all of its power comes from the public, us, taxpayers, with our work, with the taxes, etc., and everything that our contributions to society that we make, allow such a bank to make these loans. So democratically, we are the ones who should tell them what to do. We are very legitimate to say so. But let me focus mostly on the role of public finance, public investment. So for the transition, for a green transition, and for us, a just transition, it's really important. It's the key, what we ask for. We need really massive and speedy investments to achieve this. And we are today in a difficult situation, that was already mentioned. And a part of it that's really important, I think, is that even though if you look at polls, etc., that are happening, many people are as such really in favor of climate action, but also quite some people are legitimately concerned about what their living standards will be in a transition process. And this is why making sure that in the kind of financing that we do, that we really take into account of the social needs. And it's also why I was really happy to hear that we talked about the care economy. I will give some example in the end. And that many of these investments, they are not, if you look at what is the profit expectations on financial markets, many of these investment needs, they do not meet these profit expectations. So if we want to go in this direction, and we have to, because if we look at all the types of costs of environmental and social crisis, they will come back to us. Our growth and our profit figures on the short term, they are giving us a misleading picture of success because they don't integrate all the problems and that we are not dealing with, and all the costs that are coming back to us that are to quite some extent already here. And that's why, first of all, because now the European Investment Bank and other parts of European public finance are being looked at a lot to still lip service to decarbonization, etc., but to push for competitiveness, to use the public money to make investment by companies more appetizing, more attractive, more profitable. And I would say, first of all, that it's really crucial to also use public investment to support the public sector itself. For example, studies have been made that to do an energy transition by a publicly led sector would be much more efficient and fast and cheaper than through a private sector. Because if you work with public investors and public sector companies, you have the capacity to mobilize a lot of money, and you don't need to make so much profits. You have a potential to gain there. It's easier to allocate, to plan, etc. That is not to say there's no role for private sector, but we often forget the benefits that public sector can have. And if you look at the amounts of climate finance, the public plays a really large role in the climate investments. And so we are really in favor of pushing a lot public partnerships between different types of public investors and also public companies. There are some examples of this. For example, during the last administration, there was a part of the Just Transition programs. There's a public sector loan facility where the EIB, in combination with grants from the EU budget, helps local governments, etc., to do affordable services in transport, in housing, etc. And these are really small programs, but which are really good and we think can be scaled up. And in the research that we made, I think 2024, yes, we found something really that surprised us as well, even though we worked for 15 years on public investment. In Europe, there is, if you take all types of public investors together, there is 11 trillion on the balance sheet of all these public investors. That's 70% of the European GDP. There is a lot of money available, which a large scale and can be used. Of course, when it's loans, they have to be paid back, but it can be on a long term. They don't have to meet the short-term profit expectations. So we really think that pushing this and really favoring the sectors that are important for decarbonization, but have an important role in the living standards of people, energy, transport, housing, but also care facilities, etc., that this is really important to combine sustainability with good living conditions, and you will also create a lot of trust in the society to go into this transition. Now, of course, it's also important that we work with the private sector, and as well as guiding them, we should really also have good conditions in place. Because one of the things, like we were talking today, we were also mentioning, for example, the problem. There's on the one hand, we look at sustainability, but the polluting activities are still there. Companies that receive public support, they should make plans and business models which are completely in agreement with reaching our, not only our climate targets, but to look at all of the environmental impact and the social impact. They need to create good quality jobs. They need to good quality products and services for people. They need to make sure that by 2050 they completely go out of the fossil economy. And there at the programs we see some issues. I just go down on the to give some small examples, not too much, but just to make it a bit more tangible. The EIB stopped financing fossil projects, good thing. It asks some climate conditions for companies it works with, but there are so many exceptions that you can increase your fossil fuel production still while receiving climate finance from the EIB to do maybe a renewable energy, or EV charging infrastructure. For financial institutions, which is 1/3 of all the loans of the EIB, there's some kind of disclosure that needs to be given, but there are no criteria whatsoever. With this way, our public money, you do a good project, but you are favoring a very unsustainable business model. On the other hand, if we look at, for example, one of the key sectors in the competitiveness, for example, battery production. Of course, as such, good that battery production can have a really good role. But if we do this in a context where these batteries are used in business model of car companies, which doesn't take into account that we also should reduce the energy use, if it's not linked to a strategy to go for more public mobility, etc., but we just try to replace normal cars, then this is not really helping. Okay, I will wrap up. With a last example, because care economy was mentioned, in a just transition project by EIB, in a just transition region, they invest in exactly a private care company, Vitalia Homes, for retirement homes, owned by a private equity company, as this was one of the examples given. So I want to mention it's, if we want to really achieve the goals, we need to use the leverage of the public money that is needed in any case for decarbonization to impose conditions so that the economic activities go in the direction that leads to just transition. And maybe this time of crisis is a good moment to rethink about what fundamentally is important and where our potential power also lies. Thank you a lot for the time. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. I do have quite a number of comments, and I know that you probably would like to comment each other, but while I'm watching the time, I would suggest that we go directly to questions and then ask the panelists to comment each other when they are answering the question, if that is okay to you. Then do we have the questions? Are there anyone on the line, Roland? And while you are checking that, I'm giving the floor. Yes.
John Storm. My question is an observation to share about the assessments of the risks that are associated with the Earth system boundaries logic, safe and just. It is about the potential loss of GDP towards the 2030s to the tune of 6 to 12% in the case of the UK. In an analysis presented not too long ago at an event where the European Central Bank was a guest. And I think that is very representative for where matters stand. Nature Finance organized the event, which is inspiring. And it applies the logic that has been developed in terms of methodology to the European economies. The loss of this scale is of such a nature that I find it very opportune to talk about it with you as a representative of parliamentarians looking for public accountability to address these issues in the mindset prevention, precaution, pollutant pays as the guiding principle for policy action. What you could expect is that the European Central Bank will gratefully use this to anticipate events and have a more stringent policy to avert the risks. So what about an agenda to support your initiative, where we on the one hand further develop a comprehensive, coherent assessment of these risks to society globally, and how to use that, given the fact that business operates short term, and by continuing to do so on the current business model, they'll go nowhere, to entice business to embrace a longer term view and go for the positive opportunities informed by IPBES, the nexus, and transformative change. And that'll stop for citizens, better health, better well-being by agroecological practices, food losses and waste, and diets that are to the benefit of citizens. That's the kind of logic that would be very helpful to give some more push to your agenda. So it's not rather a question, but rather the urgency to share this and to maybe have some views about this and to work on that if deemed opportune. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I think that this is a good suggestion. Definitely, this is something what we, as Globe and other organizations, need to be working together about having a coherent analysis about the costs. That there's at least 4 or 5 different showing that it is tenfold whatever COVID or what we can expect as this kind of a nature scarcity going over the planetary boundaries. Maybe some of you would like to comment on this, but if it is okay to you, could you sort of take a note of your comments? and we'll pick up. We have 5 questions, so we'll pick up, let's say, them in a row of 2 and 3 and 2. Then there was lady in the back, please. Oh, sorry, I didn't see.
That's all fine. Linda van Poor, I'm here in Amsterdam. Sarah, question for you. I really love that you said survival is innovate and mitigate. I'm trying to do that. That's like, and viable business cases, they need, that's what it's all about, the real economy. Viable business cases mean enabling regulatory frames. The banking sector has warned, the central banks have warned yesterday in the FT. What is happening now with deregulation, and Circa and Manuela, they are fighting in the European Parliament. This deregulation will complicate everything. We need simplification, we need data, we need simple data, accessible data. We need a grip on value chain, as you said, to service. I love how you said that. We really need a value chain grip in order to service what we do and to make the best performance. Now, question to you, how can we seduce boardrooms in companies like yours to speak up and say, hey, this doesn't help good business cases? Because as Benoit was saying, some businesses, and they're very powerful in this parliament, have an interest in complication because they have an interest in gameability. So how can we have you and others, and then Clearly, so there's many businesses that actually do the good stuff. How can we seduce them to speak up and join up and help MEPs like Circa make their case here? How do we do that?
A panel like this, a start.
Sarah, so how can we help you and others to speak up? And then we'll pick up Yanis and then the next row of questions. You didn't? Then...
I'm his double.
Yeah, so
we're attached
so you double.
Just a few reflections and a quick question. The first is that Earth for All, and we've been struggling with this deep issue of how we shift the over-financialized economy for quite some time. We've just published actually a paper yesterday on how we shape the financial system that serves people and planet. Now, we've put in place a great deal of the policy recommendations. We've all worked, many of us, in this area. And Sirpa, you and I have probably worked the longest overall in trying to figure out what we do, for example, with the taxonomy. Now, the question is, we know that the taxonomy in the end was a political deal. We know that the omnibus is also a political deal. And yet, everything we've heard is absolutely 100% rational around the fact that we should not deregulate. What then are the key short-term levers that we should focus on, whether it be to try to get a deal within the parliament or something else? Is it looking at national accounts and also business models to try to shift directly the over-financialization, although we know that that is difficult? Is it dealing with the central banks? Is it dealing with the EIB? So that was a question landed for you, Hans. So what are the strategic levers right now when we have such a counterattack on the rational thinking that we've proposed?
Thank you. And just to mention EIB, that should be financing sustainable investments, is putting quite a lot of money to unsustainable parts, and about these sidetracks and sunk investments, I think that the heavily subsidized waste incineration, when we should go to circular economy, is an example of that. But there you have a list of questions, and we'll go whole around and start with the Benoit. You can always pass your time if you don't want to comment, but Benoit, Hans, Sarah, and then Frank.
Well, Sarah, you can start because it was a direct question. So.
Okay, so maybe to address the question, I mean, well, first of all, we have, multiple policy recommendations that we, push through our government affairs, through me, for example, in the way that how to make the business case viable. So not to go into too many details, but we mentioned about the waste regulation, about the hydrogen and so on. So we are providing our voice, at least, through places like CEFIC, through this kind of panels, through trade associations, But I think it's a very good question. It could be also through public-private partnerships as well. So that's kind of the way that I think we need to get. I really appreciate to be part of this panel, but I think it's really about, and maybe relating to another question as well, we do have recommendations on certain regulations and how to go about them to make the business cases more viable. And that's what we are also recommending, and our government affairs team also being very, very vocal about it. So maybe I'll, do you want to go in round or okay?
So, I use this, a lot of people are leaving, not for lack of interest, you know, but thank you very much for your hospitality, also to Roland-Jan, at the Dutch Nationale Denktank, who this year researched circular economy, could be here. Now it's another meeting. Thank you very much indeed. And it did not exactly meet the break as we agreed, but we have to leave now for the next meeting. Thank you very much and a good continuation of your work.
Thank you, and keep up with the good spirit.
Yeah, I think we want to wrap up anyway, but just one or two things in terms of, and I think the key question is indeed, Sandrine, the political strategy, right? And I really hope, you know, I'm still an idealist and pretty naive.
Aren't we all?
Huh?
Aren't we all?
Maybe we are, but so I think we all agree on the analysis. I think, as you alluded to, we all agree on the different measures. I mean, there's, you know, we write reports every year, and the ideas have been agreed by economists for decades. But it's the political strategy and how we start winning, right? How we stop losing, and I think that goes into all of us starting to act more as a sort of one or a body. So aligning on the narrative and the political strategy, the advocacy we want to push. So I'd love to. So of course this is an occasion to do so, but hopefully again not just agreeing on the analysis. A few very quick points then, like in opportunities. I think keeping transition plans has been discussed. Robust science-based transition plans as a key lever, as a key element in the architecture. Certainly as a condition to accessing public money. Because there's big talks, of course, about public subsidies to, you know, on the back of the Draghi report to support our economy, etc. By the way, our economy is doing super well, right? If you look just at the banks, 24 and 25 are historical high profits. So EU banks have never made as much profit as in 24 and 25. It's the same in many other sectors. So this competitiveness debate is about, oh, well, someone else, and that's the US, they are making even more profit. And I want to keep up because I'm in this rat race. So, you know, to your point, we're going to have to end this rat race, and certainly in Europe, we are big enough to do that. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And it is rebalancing. It's going to be indeed long-term prosperity, so you know, lower margins, but for a longer period of time. And some people just don't want that, right? And they fight tooth and nail just to keep the rat race, which, as we know, leads to collapse. I mean, the whole machine collapses because we are eating the branch on which we are eating the branch now. We are cutting the branch on which we are sitting. So I think that's a bit the elephant in the room, this short-term profitability as was discussed. So yeah, transition plans for sure I think is a key. Central banks have a key role to play, but we can discuss that later.
Yeah, you were saying exactly what I want to say. No, I think that's what we also saw yesterday with Frank Elson and FT. I think ECB wants to do something, so making sure that so deregulation comes at a cost, and who takes those costs. And I think that should be clear, who should take that cost. I think this is a strategic argument that should be used. Is it the winning argument? I don't know. It's still a lot of, I still think also using the argument of simplification and then trying to rescue what is there and hopefully be able to shift somewhere to more the unsustainable side, like I also said before. So try to, which is hard, of course, because it was successful and lobbied again over the last 10 years. But maybe something slips. You never know. I think also the strategic arguments, like I said before, we want to have a circular economy. We want to have ramp up renewable energy. How are we going to do that if we make the financial sector, make it less attractive for the financial sector to do that, even if we have a capital union? So using simple, the financial arguments, so this is inconsistent policies that you do, can you not make it more consistent? How do we do that? I think that is a very neutral argument. It has nothing to do with regulation. It's saying, oh, you want something, how do you mobilize the money on that? And then You can still say, should it be public or private money? I think it should be both in every case. And maybe that helps a little. But yeah, I think a silver bullet is nowhere to be found at this moment. So these are my ideas. So maybe also to the Earth system boundaries and the disconnect. I think there the solution is also the same. So this is not about understanding better how big the losses will be if we don't do anything about ecosystem collapse. They are big. So it's only a question who takes the risks. And what you see in the financial markets is that everybody bets on that all those risks will be socialized. So one strategy should be make sure that the financial sector gets those losses, that it will be credible. That's the only way. This is not about regulation, this is about credibility. If it is completely guaranteed, or at least if there's a high probability, let's speak in risk models, that the losses will be incurred by the financial sector, they will shift their policies. Now, I think that's a very simple, but that is what should be done. I don't know how, to be honest, but I think it should be done.
Good points.
Yes, quick reaction. First of all, I want to get a little bit into this thing. We need to make sure that projects are commercially viable. But I think on the one hand, on a lot of the public service delivery that we need to do, no, not always. Depends with which kind of partners you work, and that's why we promote also to the cooperation of different public actors to do those things that will not be commercially viable as well. But more broadly, I think it's really important to see commercially viable in which context. If the speculative and the polluting options are not on the table anymore, the calculation between which kind of project you want to do will become very different. But if we constantly have to compete to make a sustainable project commercially viable, while all the polluting and the speculative options to invest, to allocate capital are still there, this is never going to work. Really, we are not going to make it attractive, profitable enough. Probably not. And of course, all the other long-term stability, regulation, etc., these things are also important, of course, but we will never make it competitive enough. That these things have to really go hand in hand to make this equation, I think. Then on the short-term levers, I don't have that much to add. I think that our principles are really important, and that really, as I said in the beginning, a part of the backlash is really because in the first Green Deal mandate that we had, I really think we did not pay enough attention, not just in communication, which is often said, but in real policy measures, in real solutions for people who have concerns for everyday services they need. This really helps to build the political legitimacy that we need to go forward on this. And I really believe this. One really thing that can happen, which is relevant on the European Investment Bank, this year they are evaluating their 5-year climate strategy, and it's an excellent opportunity to put pressure on them to push on these points. We will do work on this, of course, but any type of additional pressure is more than welcome on this. And third of all, the last thing is, it's how we say, the climate plans, that who receives public money should really have really solid climate plans and reinvest profits. Also, we made a study last year we looked at the 7 of the biggest corporate receivers of loans of the EIB, and these companies between 2020 and 2023 received 11 billion in loans from EIB and made 100 billion of profits. 40 or 60 of which I don't know the exact number, but a large amount of these were paid out in dividends. A significant amount were also used for share buybacks. These things, you have to stop this. We have to make sure that our public investments mobilizes a lot more financing, and this comes also with making sure that the companies who receive the money have good climate plans and reinvest their profits in sustainable activities. Thank you.
Thank you. And by the way, we would be much more competitive if we could use child labor and forced labor. And we wouldn't pay anything for the commodities, for, let's say, for the food that we produce. So it is also always a bit relative on that side. Thank you for our panelists for wonderful comments and contribution. Would like to continue discussing with you and giving all the questions what you raised hands for the next half an hour. But sorry, mistreating you guys. We need to reserve the time for the next panel also to hear the interesting comments. So once again, thank you, and we'll all get back with these issues.
Can we make a quick transition? Everyone please stay seated.
Yes.
Well, you can stand up, yes.
Stay seated.
Oh, we need to bring our...
Your own waters, probably.
Where do you want to go, Jan?
I will go where it's here.
Okay.
I need to eat.
Sirpa, it was a real pleasure.
Yes, it's a pleasure to sit down. These kind of discussions keep me sort of
keeps you alive.
What literally keeps me alive. I don't feel like that in all of the days.
I haven't said hi.
Hello.
Hi, Lars. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, there.
Lars?
My place is here.
Who is David?
Is he maybe online?
No. David, it's online? Or?
I'll keep that one. That one's mine. Thank you.
He should be here. So I'm ready. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. We are not complete, so we are waiting for. Maybe you can start because the two speakers. Yeah. Okay. As it was said at the beginning, last but not least. So, by the way, it's a great day and great debates. Unfortunately, these debates are every year or every 2 years, and then we, at least on the outside, continue in a business as usual, sometimes even worse. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to moderate this session. It's on exploring new economic models, and I will go straight to presenting our speakers, Tintje van Veldhoven, Vice President, Regional Director for Europe, WRI, Sandrine Dixon de Cleve, Global Ambassador, Honorary President, the Club of Rome, Anders Online, Honorary Member, Brickman, Honorary Member, Globe EU, Honorary President, Club of Rome, Member of EASAC Environment Steering Panel, Lars Denul, Deputy Head of Unit, European Commission, DG RTD, and David Wagner, Professor for International Business, Digital Business, Munich Business School. By the way, I'm more or less friend with everybody on this side.
You chose the panel.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that the time will not be the same for all. But I'm really happy to chair, and normally there is always a relation between moderator and the panelists when the moderator tend to say everything and then limit the time to those who should speak. In essence, that's why I will do very few provocative thoughts, which will not take more than 2 minutes. Today we have started with philosophers, and I think it's time to go back to philosophy, indeed, because it's a science of humans and going back to that. So just one quote from German philosopher Hegel: if we can learn anything from history, is that us humans do not learn anything from history.
And then just a comment on the previous panel, in particular, Benoit, on the things which you were mentioning. Why I'm afraid of omnibus? I was 5 years responsible for R&D, and I have done all in my power to simplify the things. But my conclusion after 5 years sitting there was simplification, it's simplification. So if you pack both together, simplification and deregulation, believe me, you end with deregulation because it's normally easier. And the second, it's also continuing the thought which you have done. If there is one policy bias which is really present, is in both institutions, in all three institutions, is that with energy transition and technological progress, we will solve our challenges. And that is terribly wrong. So if you give humans abundant energy, cheap energy, even majority renewable energy, but not ask the question for what that energy will be used, not actually address the production and consumption patterns leading our life, it is pretty much close to that to give us the license to kill. And that's exactly what we will do.
Yeah.
So if we do not combine also the other part of the story, we will simply not reach the target. And the last comment is really on our panel today, new economic models. Circular regenerative economy, it's a common sense. So all nature from the very first moment is based on circularity logic. Everything has its purpose, nothing is lost. And the only serious question behind is, do we consider humans as part of nature? And if we do answer on that positively, then why the hell we don't behave accordingly?
Yeah.
And I think the best advice, which my colleagues know very well, already came from the most famous Belgian Hercule Poirot, when he was once asked why he is speaking about himself only in third person. His reply was, if you are so intelligent like myself, you need to establish healthy distance to yourself. So that's actually our role, and that's very much connected also when we talk about new economic models. Cynthia, your 5 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Janis. I'll keep an eye on the clock. Wonderful to be here. And every time we speak about this more, we learn from each other. And I think it makes us become stronger. For those of you who don't know the World Resources Institute, we are a worldwide operating think tank, operating in about 50 countries across the globe. So some of the examples that I'll bring in is also to bring that outside perspective in. But let me first focus indeed on economics, right? And it was said by the previous panel, to a certain extent, our economic model is based on the stories we tell each other, right? And one of those stories actually is money. That's the great example of a story that we've jointly agreed to believe in. And but also in the idea that more money, a growing GDP, is always better for everyone. And I think Tim already demonstrated quite clearly in his presentation that while it was a good proxy for a certain while, we have come to a point where actually there are marginal returns in many places in the world, not in all places in the world. And that is something that Europe also has to realize when we talk about these debates. But for Europe, it has. Benoit called it a social construct. That's indeed what it is, right? And these are things that we made. Therefore, we can also change them. And that is something that we have to keep in mind ourselves when we think about these constructs that seem immovable. We have made them, so we can change them. While we literally can make money, we cannot make a bigger planet. And the same goes for clean water and clean air. There's only so much that we can use of those resources, but we treat our economy as if the planet is infinite. So we truly urgently need to update the stories that we tell each other about good and bad behavior, about profit and loss, about efficiency and waste. Because our system is actually built on the idea that there is an endless availability of all of those resources. And natural buffering as well is endless. And that system is starting to fail. We're already seeing it. But we're not taking it into account yet in our economic model. Making money itself is not a problem, right? But making money at the expense of our global commons, That is the problem. And that was actually a question I had for Benoit, maybe it'll come up during the discussion. How, as international quick capital doesn't have a plan, right? How can Europe carve out a space in this monetary world to actually follow the plan that we have for Europe? So changing a system always seems impossible until it's done. I think another philosopher, as you can call Nelson Mandela that way, said this. And it's really time for one of those shifts again. It's time for a systemic shift towards that economic framework that balances. It came up this morning again, people, nature and climate. And let me give you one example of how currently it's not working. The land use example. Our current economic models presume, and even the models that the European Commission is using, and even I think even RTD is using, in defining what the effects are going to be of the policies we have. If I use 1 hectare of land more, the economic models presume that somebody else elsewhere in the world will be using 1 hectare less. We all know that's not the case. We just chop down another hectare of forest, right? And that price, the price to the ecosystem services, is nowhere calculated into the overall model. So the current economic model actually does not work for our global commons. Instead, what we should be going towards is a system, an economic system, where the trade-offs, the fact that we have a limited availability of resources, and that we choose one over another as a trade-off, those trade-offs should be surfaced much more, so we can be more efficient in our overall decision-making. Now, we have heard a lot about things that are difficult, things that are not going in the right direction. I'm an optimist by nature, and I'll give you some positive examples of where we also see that change in a different direction is possible, although not completely free of threat. But I think we can say that the European Green Deal has brought us part of a framework that tries to model and to balance this better. For example, the EU deforestation regulation is basically saying you can sell a product on our market with the highest efficiency and the lowest price, but not at the expense of nature. So we set the bar differently, and that is something that we can do in the market that we have. And we, as WRI, see this having implications across the world with producing countries changing their policies, putting in place different mechanisms, including through collaboration with the private sector. They're essential actually in driving this. We are seeing the change happening. So a different model is possible, is what we see through EUDR. Legislation for beyond price procurements, what the Commission has proposed right now, will also help to set different bars upon which we then compete. In Africa, through Restore Local, we find that restoration can create $7 to $30 in return for every dollar invested. So the business cases are there. But the problem is, and our economic model doesn't solve that, split incentives. Right? We all know, and I think also in Tim's care economy presentation, it was very clear the benefits are there. Our economic models are not suited to overcome the split incentives. How do we do that better? Finally, to seek a systemic transformation of our economic models, certain challenges really remain. Right? The right accounting. Yes, we see that there are frameworks for accounting now that attempt to cover environmental impacts, such as the System of Environmental Economic Accounting, SEA. But even this system kind of pretends that there's no limits to the amount of resources we can use in the end. That really needs to change. Consistency in action. Our research shows that 71% of OECD countries have developed national multidimensional well-being initiatives in an effort to move beyond GDP. But most of them are not using them for actually defining different policies. So we've had it set as an important step. Now it's time to follow through consistently. Adoption of material targets, demand-side approaches, all these things are really lacking in how we're currently driving policy. And then making the transition work for all, including through the transition period. Right? The example of trying to get a farmer to go biological, that means actually the farmer has to invest for a couple of years, accepting diminishing returns, taking all those risks on his shoulders, to then only be awarded a higher price 3 years after you've started this process. That's not a very attractive option, right? So people will hesitate or may even resist this kind of transition because we as society are putting all the burden on them, all the risks on them. So if we want to transition, we need to listen to the genuine concerns of people, make sure we incorporate them better into our policy making. And then lastly, indeed, we need to be smart about our narrative. We've also done a bit of research on how often, this was a study of the New York Times actually, that revealed that mentions of GDP and economic growth were 46 times and 99 times more frequent than references to alternative measures. Right? So if we do not collaborate better, if we do not find that narrative. And I think this idea of the false growth, I think Rutger mentioned sustainability and well-being conversion, so wise growth versus global destruction production. I think that there's all kind of narratives that we should be thinking about. Our narrative is not simple and convincing enough intuitively. People still feel that growth is good, whereas we all know that it's not good for all and certainly not in the long term. So this narrative question is really one that we also have to see together how we tackle that more efficiently. And that's my final point. Building a new economic system is possible. It's underway in pockets around the world, but we need to really work together much more effectively. And you can always count on the World Resources Institute to be your partner. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Wonderful. I'm going to try to build a little bit on what Stincha and all the other speakers have brought forward. So as a representative, obviously, both former president and global ambassador of the Club of Rome, who really started this whole process of thinking beyond growth in 1972, I want to go even further back and go back to Bob Kennedy. That's the reality check. The reality check is Bob Kennedy already in 1968 told us that we were not placing a value on that which was most valuable. And from there, we have seen mentions in the limits to growth. We've even seen Globe had its initial conversations in 1992, 20 years later, when I started as one of the program managers at Globe here in this house talking about beyond growth. Come forward now to most recent history. And we see that CEO salaries have grown by 1,400% since 1978. So the question is growth for whom and for what? And who actually has maintained this system of GDP? And coming back to the excellent points that were made, who has the power to change it and who has the power to ensure that we don't? And I think that is really the reality check of today. The reality check of today is we are now in a scenario where defense industry, where military and AI and fossil are very much strategically maintaining our budgets directed towards that which is completely opposed towards shifting to a well-being economy. And as was so eloquently said by Tim and by others, we know very well that we need to build a positive peace in order to get towards well-being. So I've been thinking about how we shift from what I used to call the 3 Ps of people, planet, and prosperity, and the negative Ps of power, profit, and patriarchy, to what I now call the 4 Ms: minerals, molecules, military, monarchy, and you can even add mansplaining. Because the fact of the matter is we need to understand the elephants in the room. GDP has actually gone down in many countries. But in addition to that, we know very well that well-being has seriously gone down, that climate change has gone up, and therefore the impact of the broader population across the globe has been incredibly negative. And yet this is not reflected in the types of elections that we're starting to see, apart from a deep, deep malaise, which is making people vote towards both radical left and radical right. So we need to understand what this means in terms of what we actually have. Here in the European Commission and with the European institutions, since the Beyond Growth Conference, we've been working through the JRC, we've been working with DGR&I to put in place a spectrum of indicators that could move us beyond GDP, that place a value on that truly matters. We do have so many countries that have put in place those indicators and yet do not use them. But we also have the well-being economy governments that are using them, and they as well are having success in moving them forward. But where is the deepest success? And this comes back to some of the points that Stincha made. Narrative building, storytelling, grassroots development, moving from the bottom up to build the support towards a well-being economy at a time when we see that voters truly do believe that climate risks exist, that they do believe that actually they're directly impacted. We're seeing them vote in governments that are anti-climate change. So the key is understanding what makes them tick. And how do we hack social media and the system which is actually promoting a shift away from well-being indicators, whereas we know that well-being is, in essence, going to make the lives and livelihoods of more people better. This means thinking through what we've done also in our Earth for All modeling, looking at social tipping points and environmental tipping points at the same time, both the negatives and the positives, understanding that we will never be within the planetary boundaries unless we address poverty and inequality. Understanding the fact that we have to have multi-governance plans. This is not a top-down federal plan. This is a local initiative, a regional initiative, and a global initiative. As Rutger indicated, we are looking at national accounts and how we can change the national accounts. We are looking at the broadest international indicator spectrum, where we now have a new expert group, which is being appointed by Secretary General Guterres. But what we need now is a better understanding of where are those levers of change. And where I was much more in belief that by addressing, for example, our reporting requirements, our taxonomy, our finances so that we invest in green versus then brown, I now increasingly understand, and it took a bit of time after we saw what happened with the taxonomy, and now we're seeing what's happening with the omnibus, that this is purely political. So we may have all the rational evidence to steer us in the right direction, the data, the science-based decision-making that we thought we could have, and yet we keep steering off course. That is why we need to get much more intelligent in terms of the way in which we use the system to hack the system. And that is why we talk about increasingly, or I talk about Cambridge Analytica for good. It means exactly as Stincha was saying, but in a different way, using broad storytelling, using broad understanding of how people think so that they elect the right governments in place, so that they start to ask for what they feel they are due, and they stand up and start to call for the change that they deserve and we all deserve. That doesn't mean we scrap science-based decision-making. All three of us sit and develop the System Transformation Hub. We all fundamentally believe that evidence-based decision-making and value-based decision-making, as we put in the System Transformation Hub, compass as well that myself and Yannis developed, are ways in moving forward. But it means we as a community, and coming back to Rutger's point, have to be much smarter collectively as what the messages are. Forget degrowth at this time. Think about growth for what and for whom. Beyond growth, in what way? What type of indicators, stories, narratives which enable us to move forward in order to make this a reality and the new reality, rather than continuously fighting against those big 4Ms that I presented to you before.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Anders. I see you have already unmuted yourself, Anders. So, Anders, if you are hearing me well, it's
yes.
5 minutes for the comments.
Thank you very much. And I had prepared a presentation, but I think I skip it because it would be a lot of repetition. I could have many hats today, as Janusz indicated. I'm a former president of the Club of Rome, former president of Globe EU, and I'm also a member of the International Resource Panel, where I have the honor to serve under Yannis as chair. But today I'm giving some comments on behalf of ESAC, which is the European Academies of Sciences Advisory Council. We have 3 panels, one on energy, one on biosciences, and one on environment. And I have served on this environment panel for the last somewhat 10 years. And ESAC represents all the academies within the European Union member states, plus Switzerland, the UK, and Norway. And we bring together some of the best brains to focus on important challenges. And we have produced a number of, I would say, very interesting reports over the years. And the most recent one was a commentary where we tried to take a look at the whole and asking ourselves, how is the European Union doing in terms of decision making and implementation of decisions with regard to the conflict and tension between the economy and nature, our life supporting system. We did a similar report in 2020, and our advice at that time was for a thorough transformation of the system. And I'm afraid that very little of that has taken place. But of course, we do recognize the Green Deal as a step in the right direction. Absolutely. But we also feel that it's very important for decision makers in Brussels today to understand that we are not on the right course and we need to follow up and make much, much more out of the Green Deal than what has been the case. And unfortunately, we recognize that there are forces within Europe, and Sandrine just alluded to them, that are not really on that page. There have been many science reports over the last couple of years focusing on environment and climate, and we conclude that all these reports point at one thing: all the indicators are negative, which means that the need for transformation is even greater today. I would like to allude specifically to the International Resource Panel, because I think it's so important. In the climate debate, we have a tendency to focus primarily on the phase-out of fossil fuels, which of course is very important. But unless we understand the role played by material consumption, we are not going to make it. In our most recent report, Global Resources Outlook 2024, we conclude that the extraction and processing of major materials like biomass, steel, concrete, aluminum, ammonia, electronics, textiles make up 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there you understand that we have to look at the economy, the material consumption, and not least in high-income countries, do our best to try to curb this constant increase in demand for natural resources. That cannot go on. In this report, we have tried to motivate decision makers to continue the Green Deal and to make it stronger. And we allude, of course, to the way we measure things, and we come to the same conclusion as Stintje and Sandrine. We have to focus on well-being and well-being indicators. I also think what is very important is education of people. Sandrine alluded to the negative role played very often by social media today. I'm absolutely convinced that we need to reach out to people in their villages, in the cities, in the rural areas, and initiate discussions and dialogues around the future we want. Otherwise, we are never going to make it. And we have also to engage conventional economists much more. We make the point in our commentary that the natural resources, nature as nature, is not part of the economic model. So you could say that conventional economies are nature blind. Some people even say they are energy blind. It made probably sense some 150 years ago when the population was small and the economies were not big, to look at it this way. Today the world is full, and we have to reform the economic model. And here I must say I'm very disappointed that conventional economists have not been more proactively involved in the debates. They seem to be totally ignorant of the role they play in the economies. So I think I stop there. In our commentary, I think we provide a lot of very good arguments why the Green Deal should continue and why it should be strengthened, and why the European Union should not adopt the kind of policies that the Trump administration is now doing. Because it's not only anti-climate mitigation, it's a war on the environment. If you read the op-ed by the new head of EPA the other day in in Wall Street Journal, you will see what I mean. It's a disaster from the point of view of health and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders, a lot. Many of the things which I could also say, because we are connected inside the International Resource Panel. With that, I'm going to our next speaker, to Lars. Lars, 5 minutes for you.
Thank you very much. I'm a bit in the same position of many things already having been said. I will just focus on some of the initiatives that we've been taking as the Director General for Research and Innovation in the European Commission in this context, and then more specifically on measurements beyond GDP, which has been our main focus, but also a focus on more on the micro level with Industry 5.0. So in the whole framework that was already very well explained today, we believe and we see that there is need for a better balance between economic growth, environmental protection, and social equity. So the three of those are at play there. We need, one way or another, new economic models that move the focus beyond GDP, beyond just the economic growth, on well-being, environmental sustainability, and quality of life, to be better placed to address the big challenges that we face. As for the European Union, the Article 3 of the treaty says that we are there, or one of the prime missions of the European Union is to enhance the well-being of the EU citizens. And that is something we should never forget about. It is not just about economic prosperity or the single market, but we're here to enhance well-being. Now, from the idea that what gets measured gets done, which may have already been quoted here today, and I've heard in many conferences before, we wanted to look at how can you measure that well-being in a different way, moving beyond GDP. And we have been working very closely with some partners, some of whom are in the room here, but also within the Commission, and then notably with our colleagues in the Joint Research Center, the JRC, who have developed a sustainable well-being framework. And we are now actually, we are moving more and more together, we're more and more collaborating with them. I can give you a number of examples of some of the efforts that we've also historically done on our own to start with as DG for Research and Innovation, and how they have grown and have further been integrated into joint commission efforts. Via Horizon Europe, which is our framework program for research and innovation, we fund a number of projects in the field of beyond GDP and on sustainable and inclusive well-being. One of these is Merge. We saw Rutger here earlier today. We also fund To Be, Wise Horizons, SPES, Real, and Wiser. We all have different angles to cover, but then all come together also in Merge. And they aim to enhance the capacity of policymakers to integrate well-being, inclusion, and sustainability indicators into a policy-making framework and into multi-level governance. These projects have last year joined forces to deliver a science-based advocacy paper. So based on their scientific findings, they developed an advocacy paper which is called A European Agenda to Navigate Uncertain Times, which I definitely recommend reading to all of you. It came up with a number of concrete recommendations across a wide range of policies on how to achieve sustainable and inclusive well-being. So well-being for all, not just for people now, but also future well-being for future generations. We in DG Research and Innovation, and notably in our directorate, which is called the Prosperity Directorate, I would say aptly titled, we started working on Beyond GDP already several years ago, which started with the first edition of the Transitions Performance Index, which may ring a bell to some of you, the TPI. We had a second edition of that as well. And there our focus was on a composite indicator built up out of 28 separate indicators to measure and rank progress at country level in 4 general fields: economic, green, social, and governance transitions. And governance also indicating the institutional and the legal dimensions. index, that work was followed by a study in which we tried to look how we could reduce the number of indicators used in the TPI, reduce it further because we were convinced that composite indicators are complex and difficult to work with on the one hand, and also on the other hand that fewer indicators may actually facilitate uptake by policymakers. So in other words, if you have too many indicators, if it's too complex, people can use it to spin things any way they want, and there's always certain balances to be made, certain weights to be attached to certain indicators. And so we wanted to simplify. And in that study that we did, which I also personally thought was a very interesting one, we did it with an institute called Vitosha. They developed a framework of 12 indicators, and then what was at that time a bit of a crazy framework, only focusing on 5 indicators, which was a very, very limited set. Now, our director at the time, Peter Drull, many of you will know as a friend, he thought we should be even a bit crazier and we should go for a 4-indicator framework, which we then dubbed GDP plus 3. And that framework looked at which indicators can we select that cover the 4 basic dimensions that I mentioned earlier. So it's the economic, it's the environmental, the social, and the institutional. How can we find 4 indicators that are readily usable by policymakers to navigate these complexities in a very limited set of indicators? And we published that work that was also communicated to the community, and we continue to work on that. On the other hand, we have our colleagues of the JRC who actually come from a very large set of indicators. They basically looked at all the indicators they could find and tried to reduce that, and we are meeting each other somewhere in the middle of this. So they have a more broader framework that is a sort of dashboard for measuring this sustainability and well-being, and we have our GDP plus 3 meeting them at that site. And we join forces to see where we can have introduced this to policymakers, where this could be taken up, and then especially in first instance in the Commission. Now, when you say the Commission and working with indicators, you of course think also of the European semester. And we have done some research on that, the use of these indicators in the semester, and see that they already have a prominent place in the country reports so far, and in the country-specific recommendations issued by the member states. So they are not new or lack any uptake, but it's clear that the interaction of the indicators could be better analyzed, more explicitly, and given a more prominent place in the actual narrative of the country reports. It's, for example, important to ensure that economic growth does not go at the expense of environmental degradation and that it benefits all citizens. And I think many speakers here today have already touched upon that. With the JRC, so combining both of our approaches, we have now started developing use cases for beyond GDP metrics in policymaking, encompassing the social, environmental, and institutional dimensions of prosperity. So we are looking where can this best be implemented and where could it be taken up. And other services of the European Commission as well are working on developing green GDP metrics or net domestic product and other monetizing ecosystem services. We're very keen, as we have always been, to learn from all of you and from the community, to contribute to the debate on the economic models, to also stimulate that, to also give you a sense of how the Commission is positioned in that, and the efforts that we also try to do to make sure this becomes a part of European policy making, and all of that in order to address the big challenges not only Europe but also humanity faces these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Last but not least panel, and last but not least speaker, David.
Thank you very much. Just a quick reminder, my name is David Wagner. I'm a professor at Munich Business School, private business school in Munich, Germany. I'm actually a professor for digital business, so I don't represent, let's say, the traditional sustainability movement here, but more of a digital thinker, and I hope I can add some value to this discussion nonetheless. I brought a couple of suggestions. I hope just a few at the end of this long morning and conversation. I was actually socialized into the Club of Rome Limits to Growth Thinking fairly early on in my academic career, during my bachelor's already. But it was kind of coincidental. It was a seminar, it wasn't in a structured curriculum and so on. It was because I had an interest and then kind of stumbled across this. and then kind of never lost the interest. And of course, I've been following the different concepts that were developed and some of the kind of further publications, but then realized over time, actually, there's no proper integration into curricula. So, I mean, if we look at business school curricula, things that business students are being taught, these things will come up, but they will not come up systematically. Yeah, they are not embedded structurally into these curricula. So this would be my first type of suggestion to actually do this. Now, actually being part of this panel is very humbling because we have the Club of Rome people here, but we actually had the donut economics people earlier. I think a second point is we have these multiple models that coexist, and I think that's part of a growing field, a maturing field. You have these different ideas. But then I think once a field matures, these kind of different ideas, they have to kind of grow together in a sense. And I think that point was made earlier also, and I liked the couple of points by Rutgers earlier. So I think it's time for kind of merging these different schools and ideas, and then as a business school scholar, particularly putting them into practice. So I like that kind of practice example of the deal, the Donuts Economics Action Lab. So maybe we need more of these action lab type of things so we can see how these, I think you need to use the pad, the mouse pad. Yeah, thank you. So I think we need more of these action labs to see how these ideas play out and work in practice. So basically a unify and apply strategy for these different models and ideas. Yeah, and then another thing that I observed by looking at the different models that are out there is I think a recurrent theme is this idea, this notion of systemic thinking. And I mean, that was in the limits to growth already. You have all these loops and diagrams with the feedback loops. But I mean, it's also inherent in donut economics and the donut and circular economy. So I think that circling, maybe we can have a discussion later. I think that idea of circling and loops and feedback loops, that is inherent in many of them. And appreciating and maybe learning how we can build open systems, so allowing people and voices to come in. Interconnected systems, so appreciating that we can't do things in isolation. And there was a third one, which I think I forgot, but it doesn't matter. Interconnectedness, it doesn't matter. And a third point is, of course, and that brings me back to one of Yannis's points earlier, so we need to make value judgments. So maybe, and back to philosophy, maybe. So it's not just about what alternatives there are, what we're using them for, and why we would like to approach and use them. Yeah? So this is another point, a deliberate act in a sense. Okay, and I think those were three main points already. Maybe a bit of bringing back the digital loop and looping back to my own background. I've been working on communities for a long time, digital communities maybe, and I think I've extended this kind of thinking to a community-based strategizing, organizing approach, and some other organization scholars are on board with this. And I think we've heard like our community on several occasions today. So I think there's this notion of we stand for a certain community, but there are also other communities that we can tap. So I think this kind of maybe integrating different stakeholders into not necessarily local, geographic, bounded communities, but more digital, idea-bound communities. I think this is strong, it has promise, and maybe is something that I can bring from my own field and background. Yeah? So, I'm not sure.
Thanks.
I'm good.
That was lost luggage, so you don't know what sacrifice I have just done. Because I will have to go to airport, probably. Anyway, thanks to all four of you, but because we have obviously, like it was envisaged, spent already the time which was planned to discuss among ourselves, we will immediately open the floor. And because you have, by the way, commented each other quite nicely already till now. So that was the first hand raised, second, third, fourth, fifth. Please.
Thank you. Tobias Kroll from Seas at Risk, the European umbrella of marine NGOs. Things I would like to pick up what you just said, David, about the action labs and like applied examples. I think that's something we didn't hear a lot today. So sometimes it remains strangely abstract, like identify complementarity indicators, whatever. Yes, how do we bring that to the people actually, so that they experience that well, growth doesn't equal well-being, for example. Of course, the Donut Economics Action Lab is doing very important work in bringing also the donut to municipalities, for example, but frankly living in Brussels, where the donut is supposed to be embraced by local city government. I mean, between the air pollution and the gang wars and the inequalities and the misery, well, I'm not sure I'm living within the donut actually in that city. So I would like to propose one concrete experiment or field of work where we have a unique opportunity to apply the donut or a regenerative economy right now. That's the blue economy. There is the EU Ocean Pact, is currently under development, will be published in May. There is the UN Oceans Conference around the corner. There's a lot of discussion around beyond growth or regenerative blue economy approaches and so on in that space. And I think what is really interesting is that in contrast to the land-based economy, with all its old industries and so on, which is very established, very rigid, very difficult to change as we experience all the time, car industry, whatever. So in the ocean, it's extremely dynamic. I mean, with offshore wind, with new mining project, deep sea mining, God beware, but also marine genetic resources, blue carbon capture, and so on. So bringing in this dynamic space all this together within a blue donut, as we call it, and prototype how such a sufficiency-based alternative economic paradigm can look like would be a very exciting experiment. And yeah, it's also an invitation. I mean, we are talking with the System Transformation Hub, but of course it's always a bit in the niche, like the blue economy, nobody really thinks about it. Yet it's a massive factor of our economy. So think seafood, think energy transition, and so on. So I would like to bring that to the attention of the panel and maybe some reactions if this somehow resonates with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I will just pick up your comments and questions, and then we will answer collectively. I have understood that one is also on the net. Adam, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to speak up for economists, because they say economists don't speak enough about the transformation of the model. I know a lot of economists who were in the Earth Summit of 1992 and completely reoriented their career after this important conference. But I have a question. Because I agree with what Sandrine said about using broad storytelling is needed. Think for growth, for what, and for whom. So I'm completely in agreement with that, what you said. But I know also very well Agenda 2030, and I'm very surprised that from the whole morning, during the whole morning, nobody spoke about this agenda, which is an agenda for the international community, developing countries, many of them really, at least communities in developing countries, are taking this agenda very seriously. And I find it a bit puzzling for me that nobody during the whole morning, and that we have a meeting for sustainability, but not for sustainable development. Sustainable development was also not mentioned. Isn't it something that we should take care for at the moment if we want to speak with the rest of the international community?
Thank you for that question.
And by the way, I'm a member of the Club of Rome at the EU chapter.
Wonderful. Very good question. Sirpa, you were next. I have now just taken over the chairing of this session. Sirpa, you were next, and then here, and then I think there was a hand over there. Okay?
Thank you, and my question is to David, and hopefully to leave it with the JRC, the ESAC, Anders, and the rest of the panelists, and it is, could we develop a joint project with the AI and quantum computing to create even a more sophisticated system models and to create simplified indicators, and based on that, and better understanding explanation for people. And then the last but not least on this line is, now when we have this European University Initiative, could some universities like yours and others take up the initiative and to create that thing with Isaac and others?
Thanks. Victor, you wanted to ask?
Yes, thank you. It's a clarification question, and it's on two terms that you used, Sandrine. One was when you said that you reject degrowth.
I said it's not a good thing to use degrowth at this time.
Right, so it's about rhetorics. It's not about the diagnosis on decoupling.
Absolutely not. It's about the use of language.
Okay.
And exactly what Rutger was saying is that we need to get smarter in the way in which we unify our movements.
Which we're also having in real as debates of how do we frame messages to different audiences at certain times. So I just wanted to clarify that, so thanks, that was very smooth. The second one was when you said that people tend to vote either far right or far left, would you imply that this is bad or that both are equally bad and so on and so forth? Because if, as in French, let's call a cat, as we say in French, frankly, we've talked today about intensive taxation, we've talked about calming or limiting or even cancelling the power of the 4 M's that you were describing, some toxic, disproportionate corporate power, all these eco-social type of normative goals and so on and so forth. And sorry, if I'm frank, this is much closer to Yanis Varoufakis or to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or to Jeremy Corbyn or to Jean-Luc Mélenchon than to centrists or so-called centrists, for people who identify. So I wanted to know whether you could clarify what you meant by, I felt almost a negative tone, as in people would vote far left. I think if they vote more for DiEM25 or more for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, personally, I'm happy.
So I'll answer that afterwards?
Yes, you will answer. We have the lady there.
If I can link this, because it follows up on the question that was Victor's.
Okay, the question.
Yes, I will just read it. It's for Sandrine, from Melanie. She says, Sandrine, you're calling for broad storytelling, but today's session seems to be dominated by the progressive left. Quick count, how many conservatives are in this room, in the Spinelli building today? If none, why not? How does the Beyond Growth movement plan to engage a truly broad group of people, well beyond the left, so we can partner with those who disagree with our quote-unquote woke ideology to achieve bipartisan action given today's sharp political shift towards the right?
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. And the last question.
Yeah, I actually also wanted to go back to the leadership that we just talked about. My name is Linda Mack. I'm working from Street currently, but I also studied business and just graduated from my bachelor's. I think that I can say also not only private universities but public universities suffer from the same issue, that we don't get this perspective on business or on the global world, how economics, how business should be working. We're just getting this capitalistic, neoclassical view on that we need to make profits, that the 5 M's that you were talking about, that they need to be enforced. And I feel like it's super hard, especially for my generation, especially for young people who do value well-being. I think that in our generation it's becoming more and more important that we do have a work-life balance, but how still we don't get this educational way in like achieving to combine both, because I think we actually, or my generation actually wants to achieve this, but we're not getting the possibility. I did inform myself personally, and because of that I was interested in like post-growth and how we can achieve well-being. But I don't think any of my professors ever mentioned that to us, and I think that we're just not being educated well enough. So I wonder how we can, I think that's the thing we're lacking most, just getting it to the people, because I think actually many people would agree, and many people would say, okay, that makes sense, but they just don't get the right education and we don't communicate well enough. I feel it.
Thanks. Yes, please.
I work at the European Environmental Bureau and I represent the Real Research Project in the Advocacy for Post-Growth Economies. I just have a bit of maybe of a provocation question type of, because all we heard today was about narrative change, at least quite a lot of different visions of like well-being economy, prosperity, donut economy, whatever you want to call it. And I guess like Sandrine mentioned, what we need to do is to communicate better, is to have this positive vision. And I think we do this really well. We have been doing this really well in the sense that we communicate visions of positive economy. But what the far right is doing extremely well is communicating a vision of the enemy. And this is we're not doing. We're talking about positive vision, but to get to where we need to understand what are the barriers, who are they, and if it's like the big corporation that are holding us hostages to a well-being economy, if it's the big banks, if it's those shareholders of huge companies, this is the people we also need to mention in our advocacy. And the second point, a lot was about making change and then talking to people. We need to talk to them. They will understand better how to make change. People cannot make ends meet. Like, you just need to walk around Brussels to understand that there's a crisis in this economy, and we do not have a social provisioning system. They cannot afford food. It's like whether, either housing or like transport, whatever, jobs are not even, people work 2 jobs and cannot provide for their families. So the problem in our economies today is that we have huge democratic deficits. And we cannot make change without giving the power. And I guess you also mentioned power is a bad thing, but I think it is a good thing. We need to understand that we need to give power to the people, ordinary citizens, communities, workers. And how do we do so? Because if we do not do this in our movements, in our organization, we're not going to do the change ourselves. We are only a tiny fraction of people, putting forward those kind of visions.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We are running a bit short in time, but definitely I would like that we conclude this in a sensible way so that each of the panelists can answer the questions which were there on the table. And then going back to you, Jesus Christ, Anders, when to do the concluding, and maybe you can join your answers also with the concluding remarks, if you would agree. But I would start now with you, David, and going backwards.
I think I'll pick up 2 points. Your questions, because they went directly to me. So yes, I do believe that computing power helps in building better models. So that's a quick answer maybe. And I do see that some of my colleagues, for example, even at university, already kind of build curricula that are then shared with European Union money, actually, European curricula that are then shared with other institutions, and people can pick and select either the whole thing or different parts of it, and they can basically build it into their own institutions, which is a nice approach, I believe, and that is scalable in a sense, and that's already done with public money. So that's in my view, a good idea. Second point about, I like the online comment a lot about the progressive left in the room. I think that's what our communities are about. I mean, this is a digital open space. It should be deliberately open, so we have different voices in here that can actually come and contribute to this discussion. So I think that just kind of makes my point. Yeah, we should embrace this diversity of views, and we shouldn't be a progressive left room only, because then we're losing quite a bit of the relevant stakeholders in this discussion.
Thanks.
Sorry?
Majority in here is not left.
No. No.
Lars, I just wanted to go
sorry.
Fine. No, it's fine.
No, it's okay. Quickly on the big question around left and right. I'm not saying that either are wrong or right. I'm saying somehow we're seeing that the elections are moving to the polls and not in the center. How do we actually meet people where they are? And this comes back to the question that was online. What is our narrative? What is our way of bringing more people into a well-being economy? Because they're all craving that well-being economy, as we've just been told. They're all suffering across the board. I mean, most inequality has grown in North America and in Europe, not outside, not in the global south. I mean, if you walk down the streets of San Francisco, you'll see the highest homelessness rate. Why is it that the largest majority in California ever voted for Trump? Why? And so somehow we've missed the boat. Let's be honest. What does that mean in terms of rethinking? Now, is Cortez doing the right job in terms of bringing those people back on board? Let's see. But the fact of the matter is somehow we missed the boat. And we need to look at ourselves in the mirror and understand what that looks like then in today's reality. That's what I call about morality hacks. We need to hack the system. We need to be one step ahead. We need to absolutely think about educational programs. It means business schools, and we're doing that right now and I'd love to work with you in trying to shift business schools for students that go through who understand that actually good business is not traditional business as usual. We need to take into consideration the cost of inaction. For governments, when governments tell you, but hold on, we've always used GDP. We all know that's bullshit. Excuse my language. GDP started productivity post-war for a very precise reason. Now we know that with climate change at 1.5 degrees, we will lose 3% of GDP, and at 3 degrees, we will lose upwards of 10 to 17%. Use that statistic to convince governments that why are we sticking to GDP and move towards different indicators? Now, the problem is, for the Global South, absolutely this is part of the 2030 agenda, and we wrote a report called SDG for All and have been working with the Secretary General. But the fact of the matter is that most of the Global South still thinks that the planetary boundaries are a capitalist plot and a Western plot to take actually their resources away and not address inequality and poverty head on. So we need to get better at describing that they go together, that actually we have to address the social tension of growing inequality and poverty, and we have to address how we can stay within the operating space. The tension that we have today is the difference between the political correctness that we see of most of the center for not calling out, and we do see it on both sides, not calling out the fact that actually those big ends are there and they are using their power to manipulate everything. And that political correctness has killed the Democratic Party in the United States. How do we actually hold leaders accountable, both in terms of business leaders and also governments, to move away from that morality gap that I'm talking about and start to lead for the betterment of most people? What does that look like? How do we build up the underbelly of change, working with those leaders, empowering those leaders? And does it help to name and shame currently President of the European Commission? Or do we need to somehow figure out how we champion this in a different way? And I don't know, that's the key tension that we're all struggling with. So I think I'll leave it at that. Maybe the last point on applied examples. There are many applied examples. Shared economy examples, donut examples, well-being government examples, fisher folk now starting to work with big insurance companies because the insurance companies are figuring out the immorality of not being able to insure fisher folk. So we need to take those examples and turn them into a reality for governments and for people. I think I've hit everything. No, AI. AI is a big issue. That's the molecules that I was talking about. We are moving towards trying to get as much fossil energy into the system right now because of AI and quantum. That is clear. Geopolitics right now are directed towards molecules, electrons, and minerals. Everything that the US economy is doing is in order to enable the use of AI and quantum and be ahead of the game. And that is a big issue. But as we said, it could potentially, if we transform quantum in Europe and AI in a very different way for good and an ethical way, then maybe we can do the right thing. But right now, it's not going in the right direction. So how can we truly create the digital transition that we need? Because we have not done anything in proving that actually we can continue to decouple, and for the moment we can't, in moving towards our objectives, if we continue to move towards competitiveness in the digital space.
Thanks. Cynthia?
Briefly, 3 points. EU Ocean Pact, this idea, I think you're talking to actually my colleague this afternoon, what you mentioned, so I think he'll be very interested to talk to you about prototyping. Love to hear back. Agenda 2030 and sustainable development, absolutely critical, which is why I say when we have a discussion here about growth, we have to note, we have to be very much wary of the fact that this is a very different discussion in other parts of the world, where they have an enormously growing population that they still need to cater for. And that still means that also in those countries there is an absolute case for that growth to be sustainable, because they will be depleting the own resources that their population depends on so much. And the example I gave about restoration in Africa is one, but there's many more in India and across the world. So definitely a critical point of attention. Europe alone will not be able to stay within the planetary boundaries. We can only stay within the planetary boundaries as a world system. And therefore, for this sustainable development in all these parts of the world, which fortunately also we're seeing it happening. India going to acquire 80,000 electric buses, but also putting their efforts in 2- and 3-wheelers so as to avoid everybody having to go to their own individual car. China investing massively in solar panels, renewable energy, trying to actually catch up the growth with the growth of sustainable energy, so as not to fuel that inherent growth because of growth of population with fossil fuels. So critical point, and indeed, fortunately, lots going on there as well. On the point of how do we grow the movement and different voices. Before joining the World Resources Institute, I was a politician, and I can tell you actually that my ears were more important than my mouth. And so truly listening to why people feel left behind, which is very often a reason why they vote extreme, because they feel that relatively speaking, everybody else has been doing better over the past 10, 15 years, and they are left behind. And that feeling of being left behind also makes them turn away. So how do we reconnect? How do we truly listen to these people that feel left behind? And how do we integrate what their needs are into a solution which is a true solution for all? And I think that is a big challenge that we still have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, maybe just very briefly. On the economists having no interest in this also goes against our experience. We want to continue supporting research in alternative economic models. We want to support research in beyond GDP, in metrics, getting the data right, which will lead to better evidence-based policy making. That's one point. AI models, yes, absolutely. Very good idea. We do support. By chance, it's in the same unit that my colleague Diana and I are part of. AI in science. We will be taking a number of initiatives for that. And that is using AI for good, AI using it for better understanding the world, and also in a way for the European position in science and advancing the European position as opposed to maybe other parts of the world. So that's also an important aspect. I will not go into the political aspects too much, but just to mention, because I mentioned it in my speech and I didn't come back to it, we have this initiative called Industry 5.0 already since a couple of years, and it is a sort of idea also developed together with ZIR, an expert group that Sandrine is also part of and used to chair. And that is a sort of long-term vision for European industry. It focuses on sustainability, human centricity, and resilience. And I think our experience there, we have working groups in which we have more than 200 European industrial companies, some of them very big, Schneider Electric, Danone, are also part of it now. And what is a bit surprising there is how big this, the realization that for the longer term competitiveness and for the longer term viability of these companies, they have to make a shift towards more sustainability, being human-centric, being resilient. That is a bit surprising and a very positive experience that we have. So the companies also realize it, which is why I wanted to say, be careful with painting the enemy in a certain way. There is this realization. I think the main issue is long-term versus short-term. So if we now have a return to this short-term vision, we will lose track of what is really important in the long term. And many people, I was going to say everybody, but many people do agree that there is need of a long-term change, and we should keep that in mind and keep that at the very least on the back burner while we go through a period of short-term vision. But it's inevitable that it will be very important in the future.
Thanks a lot. By the way, thank you to everybody in the panel. I think it was a great panel. Just one remark on the economists. I fundamentally agree with you that we are still doing, well, if we would look what as economy of science is teaching today in universities, we are absolutely on the wrong course. So we are not teaching the right economic science, and we are exactly teaching the science which is leading where we are. And that's the core problem, not that we are not economists who are dealing. I'm also an economist, but by the way, this is just helping me understanding better what we do wrong. But that definitely I will do very short wrapping, but in few sentences. But Anders, it's now on you to somehow summarize the today's debate, including the last panel.
Oi, that's not easy, but thank you. It's been a very rich conference, and I think the start was the best possible with Tim Jackson. I do recall when he presented his Prosperity Without Growth in 2010 in Stockholm in a conference, and that was impressive. But this talk today was even more impressive, and I think the starting point or the main entry point, namely that well-being must start with health, I think was a very, very accurate way of describing it. And this plea for balance and using the body as a metaphor. And then also sharing with us some of the data with regard to carbon and employment, I think was very interesting. So I'm very much looking forward to reading this book, The Care Economy. I'm absolutely positive that Tim will continue to provide a lot of not only insights but solutions to the transformation that we need. The panel after his talk was focusing on a number of issues. Donut economics. Victor asked the question whether there was enough money for the transition. And he referred to the fact that 800 billion euros now will be mobilized for the military. I think it's unwise to put these two things in opposition. I think rather we should look for parts of the transformation, not least the energy transition and the food transformation, as being beneficial for Europe with regard to strengthening our resilience. There are many synergies here that we should focus on. Rutger's comments on the need to integrate the well-being debates and the nomenclatura, I think, was very well received, interesting, and thank you for pointing at some of the websites that where we can learn more. The finance panel was, of course, very interesting. I'm not at all an expert, so I only picked up a few, I think, interesting remarks, starting with Benoit, who said money is a human construct, so it's easier to transform than, for instance, energy. Frank saying that the public sector makes it possible for banks to create money. We should also give more direction about what those loans are used for. I think very important point. Most people, by the way, don't know that money is created by banks the way it is. There was reference to the need for full cost accounting. And somebody said that if clean projects and sustainable projects have to compete with dirty ones and the full cost accounting is not applied, then we will lose. And I think that's very correct. There was a plea for simplification, not deregulation. I was intrigued by one comment that some financial institutions like complicated regulations because they are good at employing lawyers. I would like to understand that better. Benoit pointed at the elephant in the room, that short-term profitability is dominating too much, and we should discuss that more. And I think Frank said if finance sector will not cover the losses of a possible collapse in the ecology or in the climate, there will be no transformation. And I think those two comments, they came well together. Stintje, very much resonating the way I do, that the economic model doesn't work for nature. By the way, I didn't mean by my comment that all economists are not interested, but I would say that the dominating conventional economies, those who rule the world, they have not paid enough attention. And I think that curricula still at economic schools leave a lot to be desired. We didn't talk about the North-South problematic much. I understand very much the question about Agenda 2030. Sandrine referred to it now towards the end. I very much agree that this is, of course, a very, very important dimension of this discussion. We cannot talk about sustainability in Europe without integrating the challenges in the South. By the way, in the International Resource Panel, in our most recent report, we state very specifically the economic system championed by the Western countries over the last 50 to 100 years is both wasteful and unjust in particular with regard to many of the low-income countries. So this is something we have to focus more attention on. Lars, I think it was very interesting when you referred to a lot of research that's going on, a lot of studies with regard to well-being and well-being indicators and understanding it better. I just have a plea. Make sure that you expose all the members of the European Parliament to it, not just those who are interested. Make sure that all people understand this better, because I think that's at the heart of this discussion about right-wing versus left-wing policies. Let's face it, most of the right-wing politicians have not really bothered to learn about this enough. And I've been part of the EPP group for 10 years, so I know quite a lot about it. Finally, David, I think you made some very interesting points regarding the need to change curricula at economic schools, etc. And your points on AI and the use we can have from digital technologies was, of course, interesting. So all in all, a very rich half day, or more than a half day. A lot of interesting topics came to the fore that we have to continue to discuss and work on. So thank you very much. I was very honored to be invited.